Shall we call it? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16. Yeah, we are. Very well. The next item of public business is Assembly approval of a supplementary planning guidance P114 lodged by Deputy Scott. The main respondent will be the Minister for the main respondent will be the Minister for Infrastructure, and I ask the greffier to read the proposition.
The States are asked to decide whether they are of opinion to agree that the prior approval of the States Assembly must be sought before the implementation of the following policies further to the Bridging Island Plan. A. Interim Policy H9A, as set out in draft supplementary planning guidance, housing outside the built-up area, dated October 2022, introducing the proposed restriction of new residential development of homes outside the built-up area where they are in excess of 279 square metres or 3,000 square feet gross internal floor space. And B, Interim Policy H2A, as set out in draft supplementary planning guidance, density, dated October 2022, introducing the proposed encouragement of minimum residential density in various locations such as Lake Enevé and St Bernard's Bay.
I'm grateful to Deputy Alex Curtis, I think, for a contribution to the fund. Was it your machine that went off there? Whose was it? Deputy Hegarah, thank you for owning up. Well,
Does that double the fine? I'm just asking for a friend.
No, we will just keep the soap fine, but the charitable funds will benefit greatly from it. Very much indeed. Deputy.
Sir, before I begin my speech, I believe the main respondent is the Minister for the Environment, rather than the Minister for Infrastructure, which I believe you said.
I said Minister for Environment and the Minister for Infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
They're both involved in the...
Oh, thank you very much. I only heard that. Sorry, sir. Sir, last night, when I wasn't thinking of Deputy Tadia's father's beard,
I know, we were all in that position.
I was thinking of a song by the Canadian songwriter Joni Mitchell called Big Yellow Taxi. The lyrics say, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They pay paradise and put up a parking lot." During the COVID emergency, when lockdowns and contact tracing dominated our lives and some basic civil freedoms were curtailed, democratic government could not function optimally. Laws were amended on an emergency basis to allow government to continue in that emergency. This was understandable. It was also understandable to environmentalists, at least, why the former Minister for the Environment wanted to fulfil his obligations under the Planning and Building Law and update the island plan, notwithstanding the urgency. Both he and they had identified a different kind of emergency, one that required new policies and proposals to be brought in a rather rushed manner into the island plan. Their key aim was to better protect from further insensitive development our island's beautiful environment and neighbourhoods with a special character, or at least to make a start. I notice Deputy Taddy is with us now, and he's missed my joke about his father's beard.
I'm sure it will repeat itself through the whole life of this assembly.
It was also understandable to environmentalists, at least, why the former Minister for the Environment wanted to... I'm back at the same part in my speech. So the COVID Island Plan Jersey Regulations 2021 were approved by the former States Assembly. The very name of the regulation shows its emergency origins, and the very name of the Island Plan as a bridging island plan indicates its emergency nature. The former States Assembly accepted some changes to planning law and process to achieve this. That emergency is now over, and the time for those changes is now gone. Supplementary planning guidance was intended to fill parts of the main document that were incomplete. This included revising housing policies once the population policy had been published and approved by the States Assembly. Other guidance needed to be developed to protect sensitive character areas from inappropriate housing density and unsympathetic housing design. These included landscaping and green infrastructure policies for non-coastal areas. Further work designating conservation areas such as Gorey Village, parts of St Lawrence and St Albans, and work on developing building design guidance for heritage areas. How many times have state members heard one of their constituents complain they don't understand why a particular development has been allowed, notwithstanding that it might even have been rejected by the planning committee? I cannot agree with the minister that the draft supplementary planning guidance that is the subject of this proposition does not introduce policies. Do we understand the implications of approving these policies, which are indeed described as interim policies and numbered as such? I cannot say, despite 8 years of immersing myself in planning policy and process, that I do. By allowing the minister to approve this supplementary planning guidance and the interim policies without being informed by our debate and consideration, then we will allow a decision-making framework to prevail that already is flawed, muddled, and because of that does not serve the interests of the people of Jersey as well as it might. If approved, the proposed draft, and I'm going to call the Supplementary Planning Policy SPG, H9A, would introduce a new policy that was not debated by the States Assembly in March 2022. This is undemocratic and nonsensical. If approved, the proposed draft SPG H2A housing density would appear to introduce assessment measures that prevail over other important policy considerations with far-reaching consequences for the whole of the plan. Numerous policy implications that need to be thought through and evaluated. For example, what about higher densities in a heritage setting dominated by listed buildings? How do decision makers balance emerging policy positions about conservation areas and housing density policies? And to refer back to an unfortunate incident in our community, what about settlements on the edge of reservoirs with lower water tables and others? Should they all have the same density policies, or should they be looked at on a case-by-case basis, as is already allowed under the Island Plan with the concept of development briefs? I understand that the possibility of introducing density policy to inform decision-making has been debated in the UK for many years. It is considered to be a crude measure and not very effective on its own. Why then accept this SPG as an assessment tool in Jersey without future debate? What about development on greenfield sites? Should these be the same as all built-up area sites? Where is the policy guidance about townscape and landscape impact in the built-up areas? These are just some of the important questions that arise from the Minister's proposal to approve the draft SPGs on his own, without prior States Assembly approval. Are we comfortable to continue to allow our hands to be tied, well, not just to be tied, but to be seen to sit on them, while just one state's member approves important policy that has long-term implications for all of our communities, while little pieces of paradise in our districts are designated for potential parking lots by the Minister on the advice of planning policy makers who do not represent the constituents in all our areas. The States Assembly should be prepared to amend, approve or reject the final policy that the Minister seeks to approve. I have participated in the public consultations associated with the former Island Plan and the current Bridging Island Plan. I'm aware of their flaws and appreciate the extra protection that normally is given to local communities by the States Assembly having the ability to intervene in this high-level planning policy making if need be. Having the Minister approve interim planning policies under a process that was accepted during emergency COVID and as a part of its measures no longer is appropriate, interim or not. Poor policies result in poor planning, which our people will have to live with the results for a very long time to come, and often they are not reversible. If we care about what our island looks like, about the communities and neighbourhoods in the districts we represent, and delivering policies that enable decision makers, even amongst our States Assembly, to make decisions that meet the purposes of the planning and building law, then I do not see how we can allow these policies to be approved without our further debate. Contrary to what has been suggested by the Minister to the Press, it's time to put away the emergency legislation and plan for our people in more ordinary times. Really, we should be amending the planning law so it is no longer framed on an emergency footing and so that the States Assembly can become democratically involved again, and working with the Minister to modify and refine the emergency framework provided by the Bridging Island Plan so that it is converted through modifications to a proper island plan within the timeframe originally contemplated by the former States Assembly. This would allow us to have a fully considered and debated island plan that provides a clear and democratically approved and accountable decision-making framework that delivers the quality of decision-making that our community deserves in a post-pandemic world going forward. Now that the COVID emergency is over and we need to rebuild as a post-pandemic emergency community, environmental groups, residents, those in building design and the construction industry all need us to ensure a policy decision-making framework is produced now that meets the highest standards of democratic accountability and principles. It is not appropriate for policies that have long-term and far-reaching consequences to be approved without debate by our Assembly. If we accept the Minister's position that these are supplementary policies without understanding and debating their implications, then we are endorsing an emergency truncated approach to policy formulation that has long-term implications for important changes to our island. And we would not, and if we do not as an Assembly seek to provide a clear policy framework that adequately protects our communities against insensitive development, then we are not serving our community well. So what we really should be doing now is considering legislation that is not providing emergency powers. We are thankfully beyond that, and revisiting the rules for land use decision-making to make sure they provide the decision-making framework that is now beyond interim and bridging. It is time for the Minister to focus on delivering an island plan that enables our decision makers to make decisions within a robust and accountable policy framework so that we as an Assembly can account for our decisions and explain how we are helping our decision makers meet the purposes of the Planning and Building Jersey Law, which includes protecting the environment, heritage areas, and many other things for our communities for the longer term. Decisions that are made affecting land use have implications for this decade to come. And by approving this proposition, the States Assembly can start this process. It is not the time to turn away from being part of the future of our constituents, but to embrace the future with them. Thank you, sir.
Proposition seconded. Yes, sir. Well, does any member wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Coles.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I was middle script. I thought I was have a couple more speaking before me on this, but I will go first. I'm fine. So when this proposition first came across in Teams, as we all received them, I looked at it and read it. My first thoughts were, well, this is sort of an ministerial kind of decision. It's written in planning guidelines that the minister will bring differences and edits as it goes along. And as I started looking and started reading a little bit further, I noticed some other bits and pieces. Actually, the policies that they've been trying to be changed here are actually quite significant. And if a fellow member of this assembly feels that a plan or a change in policy is significant, that it may supersede what is given out as a ministerial responsibility or power, that they have every right to recall that document before us, and we should be allowed to debate it. So that's one of the first reasons why I wasn't sure whether I was going to support Deputy Scott on this proposition, but after a good reading realised that actually, do you know what, that's a good reason to support this. It's not directly about the policy itself, whether we agree whether that policy is right or whether that policy is wrong. It's about having the right that this Assembly should look at a large policy change that someone feels is significant enough that it should be brought before us so that we can then debate as and when if we agree with those policy changes. And then I look at the two policy. And for an example on why I think that there are certain scales of different inputs that the minister could have had over policy, and actually referred to policy H9 in the Bridging Island Plan. As a member of the planning committee, I have read that document far too many times. The fact that it's saved as one of my favourite PDF documents on my Teams, it speaks for itself. But under policy H9, and we actually had this issue with the Water's Edge Hotel, that the policy H9 actually asks for something, and it's quite vague in asking for a significant reduction in visual mass. Significant to who varies, it's subjective. The minister could have brought plans forward to say that, you know, I want to introduce a number, I want to say 25% is what I consider significant, and therefore adjust the island plan to say 25% reduction is the minimum reduction required to move along with this policy. And if that was brought here today under this, I wouldn't be supporting Deputy Scott because I believe that's a small alteration. But then this is when we start looking at actually what the policies are asking for itself. And when we're talking about minimum densities, it is changing how we're fundamentally going to start building on our island and what kind of developments we're going to bring forward, where we expect developers to bring forward to planning, to get approval. And I feel that this particular policy is going to have quite a large impact, visual impact, on our island's character in varying parts of the island. And actually, yeah, we should all have an input and a debate over whether we agree that, you know, there's 150 or 350 dwellings per hectare is appropriate for the built-up area, whether we feel that the other ratios for the other areas of town are acceptable, or whether they're being allowed to gentrify the countryside so that the poor people stay in town and the rich people get to live in their bigger houses. I then looked with policy H2 as well, and I find the number of and this one's actually quite concerning for me, and another reason why it needs to be brought before the Assembly, that if we put a halt on building properties over a certain size, members of this Assembly with properties over that size could see their properties raised by a significant value. Now, that potentially, whether meant for by the minister bringing these amendments or not, is a potential consequence of that fact. So actually, should we be being allowed to let one person make that decision, or should we all have an account as the Assembly and say, actually, do you know what, some of us don't, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, like I said, was trying to plan. Whether or not members of this Assembly should be allowed to benefit from a policy that's just passed through under ministerial direction, which could see them make significant capital gains on their property should they wish to sell. It's an option, but it might, I'm no regard saying that this is why the minister did it. It's literally just a consequence of if this goes through quite easily and us having absolutely no say over it. So those are sort of my two main reasons. And just for the record, I actually don't disagree with the policy H9A. I think it is something we are going to have to consider. as the Minister made in its comments paper, that we do have to consider these things. And there was a consultation that went out that all members were allowed to take part with, as well as the general public. But this is also another reason why I would like that particular policy brought back to the Assembly, because this minimum density dwelling policy would mean developers would be trying to squeeze in the minimum density into the space that they can, which means that the size of the living rooms on these properties will not expand unless that is added to this supplementary planning guidance. And we've heard from the Chief Minister and the Infrastructure Minister and the Housing Minister when they stopped the Kensington Place development that they don't want these kind of developments to still go on, but actually introducing this minimum density dwelling without that other change, which if it comes before the Assembly and the Minister hasn't added it, I would be bringing it as an amendment myself to increase that livable space. And I have discussed this with the Minister, and he does know my position on this. But I couldn't see that in what was presented under policy H9A. So I would want that included if I was to agree to that to go forward. So those are my two main reasons for why I will be supporting Deputy Scott's proposition.
So can I make a point of order?
Point of order?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Could I ask you to rule on the question of conflicts of interest and declaring interests? Would it be appropriate in your view for members to declare should they have an interest in or ownership of a property over 3,000 square feet when they speak, or indeed if they have spoken?
Well, I don't. I think that is a matter for members. But the point is that this decision, the made on this proposition, will not have any bearing on that. It seems to me it's a matter of whether the state is going to call this in or isn't going to call it in. No one has a direct financial interest potentially in this. But even were it so, I suspect it is something that members would share in common with a large number of other people within the island, and therefore wouldn't fall normally to be disclosed to the point of disqualifying them from participating in the debate. The answer is, to that is that it doesn't appear to me that a declaration is necessary at this stage for this part of the decision-making process. Thank you.
Sir?
Yes?
Well, I'm not sure if the Minister...
I'm sorry, what are you doing now? Is this a...
On the point of order that
Right.
you brought. Okay, I think I'll shut up.
Right. No, I mean, it's well known. I think I'm reinforcing that view for the conversation I've had with the Deputy Greffier. This decision, the decision of the Assembly would not be determining the policy itself. And it's the policy itself that might cause people to feel they need to make a declaration. Very well. Thank you very much. Yes, does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? Deputy Luce.
Thank you, sir. And every member in this Assembly has been through an election process last summer, at the beginning of last summer. They've come into this Assembly, and on the second sitting, they've elected a Minister for the Environment. And with that job comes a certain amount of responsibility, a lot of responsibility, and a certain amount of decision-making. And one of those decisions that you have to make is you have the responsibility to develop supplementary planning guidance. And the most obvious and easiest example to give would be a housing site debated through the island plan and agreed. And the particular field in question is then subject, usually, to supplementary planning guidance, which the Minister will bring forward, which guides, it does what it says on the tin, it's guidance as to how that field may or may not be developed, the type of density, the type of housing that might be allowed on it, and how we move forward. And initially, as has already been said by Deputy Coles, one read this proposition and thought, it's not right that the states get into the micromanagement of planning. Otherwise, we will spend our entire 3 weeks, every 3 weeks, trying to reach decisions. If you look on supplementary planning guidance, you will notice that there's master plan frameworks developed by the Minister, and here's two sites here, Gas Place and South Hill. There's some supplementary planning advice on things like the disposal of foul sewage, repairing walls and TV and radio masts, and there's supplementary planning notes on parking and rooftops. And in many cases, while the guidance is there and written down, it may well be that an application is approved that may be slightly contrary to guidance, because in all planning decisions, it's always a balance of policies, and it may be a policy over here is significantly weightier and carries more gravity than one over here. And guidance is exactly what it is. It's there to guide, but it's not to be the definitive answer. But members, getting back to this proposition, will have to decide whether they feel that the development of new homes, new residential property over 279 square metres is a matter for guidance, or whether it's a policy matter. And they will also have to look at the issue of density and whether that's something that ministers should be guiding on, or whether that should be part of an island plan policy which would need to come back to this Assembly and be debated, if I'm correct in my understanding. So the Environment Scrutiny Panel have looked at this. We don't have a particular view one way or the other, but what we think is it's up to states members to decide whether they think these two particular issues are important enough to be debated on the floor of this Assembly. The danger is, of course, that we then get an increasing number of things brought to this Assembly for a decision which quite normally would be taken as part of the responsibility of being elected as Environment Minister. Thank you, sir.
Very much. Deputy Hull.
Thank you, sir. I very much am following in Deputy Luce's the comments he has made, but I would just like to say that supplementary is something that is added or serving as a supplement or additional. So whilst I really appreciate all that the previous Minister for the Environment has done, and I have great faith in the new Minister, I am questioning whether these are supplementary or whether these are truly policy changes. And I would say that probably with the size of homes, that is a real policy change, and also in the density, that is a policy change rather than just supplementary guidance. And I know that the Minister has to make decisions, but equally I think these are more than just supplementary guidance, and I think perhaps these should be coming back for debate. I realise we can't debate everything, but there are certain things, and we're going to have to be, as a planning committee, we are going to have to decide on the minimum density. And as Deputy Coles has mentioned, we have to make sure that people have decent homes to live in with decent space around. And I think it is a policy change. And that's what I'd like to say. Whereas I really appreciate all that the Minister of the Environment does, but equally I think we should sometimes be able to discuss these matters and come up with what the Assembly says. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Tadier.
Thank you, sir. So generally, I'm of the same opinion that whatever appropriate powers this Assembly can have as a check and balance, which I think over the years of introduction of ministerial government have been eroded and taken away, sometimes legitimately for effective efficiency, but as a general rule, we're seeing more and more power given away from the Assembly to ministers, but sometimes not even ministers, to officers in departments, and that's could be argued to be the same in planning. Now, I'm in quite an interesting position, whereas sometimes politically we may have disagreements in St Brillards as representatives. Our politics might be either completely different or slightly different on occasions. I know that when it comes to planning issues, I think we're generally fairly well aligned, and certainly I know that before Deputy Scott was elected, we had similar concerns about the built-up areas and also protecting sensitive areas in St Brelard like St Brellard's Bay. And I obviously speak to those both as a representative of the area and because it is a large focus of this proposition. And similarly, I know that the current minister, as a St Brelard representative, also has the same concerns. I noticed in his manifesto, for example, that he focused on the fact that he had fought against planning applications that over-intensified development in the parish, and he gave examples of Petit Port and along Route Orange. And similarly, I've done the same, and I know Deputy Scott has done the same as well. And the reason I raise this is because I think it's relevant, sir, is that the Minister has inherited, like I suppose the new Assembly has, a bridging island plan, which it didn't vote for, which it didn't implement. It's a previous Minister. And I suspect, I'm pretty sure, because I heard him say, I think, sentiments to this effect during the election process, that he was very concerned about the overdevelopment there's a presumption of overdevelopment in St Brelard, which I sought to remove from the previous bridging island plan. And I think I've spoken to Deputy Scott about that. So he's inherited a plan where he may be being asked to bring forward guidance which isn't actually in keeping with what he believes and what his manifesto says, and perhaps what the new representatives of the area also believe. And I also think it's a question of magnitude. So whilst the island plan, bridging island plan, may talk about a presumption of density intensification, and we might see, for example, developments coming forward where they would have been turned down in the past, where now there's a presumption towards development, garden grabs, for example, putting an extra floor on buildings where they weren't there before. I think it's still a question of judgment and of what kind of guidance we put around that. And it would seem to me that it would be wise to have that come back to the Assembly so we can look at the nuances and the fine detail in that. What it doesn't mean is that every application is going to come back to the Assembly for a decision. It's not going to turn into a 49-person PAP, Planning Applications Panel. It simply means that we will have a chance, along with the Minister, to see what he's bringing forward, to see if it could be improved, to see if it has the general support of the Assembly. And we've talked about how important representation in all of its forms is in this Assembly. And it would be surely worthwhile hearing from community and constituency representatives about what they think about that fine detail before it is actually put into effect. So I'm quite relaxed that this is very much not just something we can vote for easily, but it's actually the right thing to vote for because it gives us those safeguards in place, sir.
Does any other member wish to speak on the proposition? No other member wishes to speak? Deputy Jeanne.
Thank you, sir. I will be brief, but I think it's important for members to really see what this proposition puts forward, because it is saying basically, as maybe Deputy Tadier was alluding to really rethink some of the elements of the Bridging Island Plan, which I think we need to caution, because there was, as we heard in the summing up of last year, at the end of last year, that it was the longest debate that's happened last year or longer time. And I'd be worried that that is opening up to many things, because for us to go into the Bridging Island Plan and start really questioning kind of the principles and the elements that were already agreed. For example, there was already an agreement in the Bridging Island Plan to limit the spread of development on greenfield sites and to make best use of already developed land. This supplementary planning guide would help develop what that looks like. And it would be worrying to see that we would, if we went into the supplementary planning guides and that was brought back to the states, that we then potentially could open up that principle and then therefore open up the Bridging Island Plan again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I must admit I've struggled slightly in knowing how to respond to this debate. There are broadly two approaches, I think. I can go on the technicality, on the arguments of technicalities, and explain why I think almost every assertion that Deputy Scott has made is wrong. But of course, the argument is actually mostly, it seems to me, being conducted on emotive terms. And, you know, I feel, therefore, that maybe I should respond in those terms. I'm perhaps less good at that, so I'm probably going to stick to plan A. But, you know, when we hear words like little pieces of paradise that will be turned into parking lots by the minister acting on his own, that is so far removed from what we're talking about here that I just cannot get my, you know, it's off the scale. We are not talking about that. We're not talking about me deciding anything. We're certainly not talking about me taking bits of paradise and turning them into parking lots on my own. So I think the emotive argument that Deputy Scott is advancing here is that in some way, well, not in some way, in lots of ways, the Bridging Island Plan is so flawed that essentially we should stop work on anything that was mandated in the Bridging Island Plan, not do any of the pieces of supplementary planning guidance that were mandated in that plan, and instead accept that it was a flawed piece of work, no longer relevant because it was conducted and put together under regulations that are no longer applicable, and therefore we should move on. I think that's nonsense. The Deputy's statement implies that the Bridging Island Plan was prepared on the basis of an inadequate evidence base, or that it was somehow rushed through. The basis for the preparation of the Bridging Island Plan was very clearly set and justified, and the assumptions which underpin it were very clearly articulated at the time. It was certainly acknowledged that it was prepared in a period of uncertainty and change, but it was prepared at a time when there was clear and unequivocal need for more homes, for the creation of better neighbourhoods and better environmental protection. And a very large evidence base was prepared and published in support of the development of the Bridging Island Plan. And this was available to inform the approval of the plan and was the subject of independent review. In their summary of conclusions, the independent planning inspectors appointed to review the draft Bridging Island Plan stated, I quote, "The evidence base for the plan is comprehensive and generally provides convincing support for the policies and proposals." This is a good island plan. Those are my opening remarks. But I think it's quite interesting. I've got two things on the agenda today. And I doubt any ministers enjoy a more varied portfolio than I do. We're developing supplementary planning guidance relating to housing density and so on, but later we'll be debating changes to our policy on replacement vessels, which is also under my remit. Whilst these are two very different subjects, there are some significant links. Both depend on careful consideration of the law, both concern the limits to ministerial discretion, and both have implications for the effective conduct of government. These are all issues that I take exceptionally seriously. In the case of Deputy Scott's proposition, her suggestion is that I've gone too far in exercising the powers granted to me under law. I want to explain why I disagree and why, in fact, the supplementary planning guidance that I'm developing is entirely normal, entirely within the framework established by the Assembly, and entirely proportionate to the aims of the Bridging Island Plan. So it might be helpful to start perhaps with some of the facts around this, rather than the emotive arguments, and consider what is supplementary planning guidance under the law. SPG is effectively defined by the 2002 Planning and Building Law under Article 6, which says the Minister may publish guidelines and policies in respect of A, development generally, B, any class of development, C, the development of any area of land, or D, the development of a specified site. It is pretty clear that the SPG under consideration in this proposition falls within these categories. It's also worth saying, by the way, that SPG is not a sudden thing that's only been brought in to cope with the problems of the Bridging Island Plan, supposed problems of the Bridging Island Plan. That's the 2002 law. There are also stipulations in the law about the need to consult, which I have done. Indeed, many of you, including Deputy Scott, interrupted your Christmas shopping to attend 2 online meetings to discuss the draft guidance at the end of last year. There was also consultation with the public and, by invitation, with the development industry. Furthermore, although I have yet to finalise the guidance, before I do so, I will have regard to all of the consultation feedback and will consider amending the draft guidance in light of the feedback before adoption. I am also committed to publishing the consultation feedback and my analysis and response to it. So I think there's no question that I am within my rights to develop this SPG, and I've gone about it in the right way. And I note within her report that Deputy Scott appears to concede these points. There is, however, a second important aspect to this. It is quite clear under the law that I can only bring forward SPG that is consistent with the island plan. That is both implicit, in that the planning and building law stipulates that only an island plan can set new planning policies. But beyond that, this point has also been the subject of explicit law officer advice. No Environment Minister can bring forward SPG that either sets a new policy direction or contradicts policy that is within the island plan. The supplementary planning guidance that I am preparing does not contradict existing policy, nor does it set a new policy direction. It is my contention that the substance of the proposed guidance entirely supports and is consistent with the policy direction of the Bridging Island Plan, which has been approved by the States Assembly. It is entirely supplementary to it. And this, I fear, is where I must disagree with Deputy Scott. She refers at the end of her report to these substantive new policies and argues that because they are new policies, they should be debated by the States Assembly. As already noted, I'm not legally able to bring new policies to contradict the Island Plan in the form of SPG, and I do not believe I'm doing so. Deputy Scott is correct in saying that these are new policies, but they are policies that are supplemental to the Island Plan. Critically, they do not introduce a new policy direction or contradict the policy framework established by the Island Plan. It's worth recalling at this point where SPG fits into the decision-making framework in planning policy, because there does seem to be some confusion about this.
I wonder if the Minister would give way for a point of clarification.
If you give way for a point of clarification.
I'd rather not, actually, if that's okay, sorry. So I think it is worth recalling at this point where SPG fits into the decision-making framework in planning policy, because there seems to have been some confusion around this, and people have been saying things like, once this supplementary planning policy is in place, it will no longer be possible to build houses over 3,000 square feet, and so on. Members will be aware that the Island Plan is the primary consideration in Jersey's plan-led planning system. It is because of this and the significant weight attached to Island Plan policy and decision-making about planning applications that the Island Plan requires the approval of the States Assembly. Supplementary planning guidance, whether it is in the form of interim policies or advice, does not carry the same weight as Island Plan policy. It is but one material consideration. Supplementary planning guidance is designed to operate under the Island Plan and is subordinate to it. SPG is an extra piece of consideration, another material consideration. Other material considerations can take many forms, including representations from people or groups objecting to or supporting planning applications. They all must be taken into account in decision-making, but do not carry the same weight as Island Plan policies. That is why the law empowers the Minister to adopt SPG and does not require its endorsement by the States Assembly. And that's the critical point about this. It fits into a framework of extra items for consideration. It does not mandate anything, and it does not contradict the Island Plan. Proposals in the Bridging Island Plan confer a responsibility upon the Minister for the Environment, mandated by this Assembly, to develop at least 13 specific pieces of supplementary planning guidance over the plan period. I really do not believe it is appropriate, warranted, or an efficient use of parliamentary time for SPG to be debated by the States Assembly. So I want to set out now the key issue, which is whether or not the SPG could in any way be interpreted as setting a new policy direction or contradicting policy that is in the Bridging Island Plan. There are two sections to this guidance. The first relates to minimum density standards. Proposal 21 of the Bridging Island Plan states that the Minister for the Environment will develop supplementary planning guidance to establish minimum densities for the island's built-up areas. It was mandated. I have not made this up. The guidance also proposes the introduction of a maximum density standard to protect against overdevelopment or supercramming. The content of this guidance note is thus simply responding to that which the States Assembly has requested be undertaken in support of and supplementary to the island plan that it has approved. It also responds to the overriding policy objectives which has been built into successive island plans, which is to concentrate development in the existing built-up areas. We need to make the most efficient use of that built-up land, and that is what the supplementary plan, this part of the supplementary planning guidance addresses. It does not, as the Deputy says, get set above other policies. It does not trump anything else. It is another factor to be considered along with other supplementary planning guidance, along with other factors such as objections, such as letters or representations of support, and so on. So density policy has been mandated by this Assembly. Now, in content terms, I know that some members have worries that this guidance will be too prescriptive and will force overly dense development in appropriate areas. Inappropriate areas. First, I would make 2 points in response. First, the guidance, if you read it, very explicitly creates categories that relate to particular areas. So the guidance is different depending on where it is being applied. It's different for town on the one hand, compared to, say, local centres on the other, and Kennervey on another. Each one has specific elements of density guidelines, and those density guidelines also reference examples elsewhere in the island of comparable developments which are familiar to people in those contexts. But second, the draft SPG contains explicit reference to some important qualifications to the density guidelines. It says, and I quote, I think this is worth listening to, given what some of the comments that have been made so far, "Density in itself is a crude tool. It is a measure of a proposed residential development, but should not be a determinant of it. To be successful, the provision of more dense forms of development throughout the island's built-up areas must have regard to the quality of design relative to its context, the quality, type, and mix of homes being created, and placemaking." That is all in the draft supplementary planning guidance. This is not an instruction to insist that all developments in a particular area hit a particular target. It is a piece of supplementary guidance to suggest where thresholds might lie, but making sure that lots of other factors are taken into account and explicitly indicating that. In her letter to States members, the Deputy raises, with respect, some particularly large and colourful red herrings. For example, she says that there are areas of St. Brillard that remain vulnerable to insensitive development under the Bridging Island Plan, including, for example, Route Orange. I have to say that I'm not sure developers would agree. Since the new island plan was passed, 6 applications in St. Bernard have been refused by the Planning Committee, including 3 on Route Orange. But in any case, this is irrelevant. The proposition is about supplementary planning guidance, not the Bridging Island plan. Let me move on to look at the guidance around housing in the countryside. This is made up of 2 parts. First of all, a clarification around policy H9. Again, as requested explicitly in the Bridging Island plan, it provides more detail around the interpretation of various parts of this policy and does nothing more. But it is, I think, the second part of this guidance, which is called in the guidance interim policy H9A, that is causing the most angst. This is the policy concerning large homes outside the built-up area and says that new homes outside the built-up area will not normally be supported if they are over 279 square metres or 3,000 square feet. It is argued that this is a new policy direction not supported by the Bridging Island plan. This I refute, and I want to take members through the argument because it is important. The Bridging Island plan provides for the development of new homes and in particular the development of more affordable homes to help meet existing housing demand and address the increasing cost of housing. Policy SP3.6 says that new housing will be supported if, quote, I quote, residential development provides housing types and tenures that reflect local housing need and market demand. Reflect local housing need and market demand. So what is our housing need? Whatever SPG I produce has to surely support that. There is, I'm afraid, no evidence that supports the need to provide more very large homes in Jersey. Quite the opposite. Most of the island's current need is for smaller homes, not tiny homes, by the way, but certainly not mega homes. Jersey's future housing needs 2009 to 21 report identified a potential shortfall of 2,750 1-, 2- and 3-bed dwellings, both flats and houses, together with a surplus of 4+ bed homes over the report period. What's more, evidence from the census suggests that over 40% of owner-occupied homes in the island were under-occupied where households had 2 or more bedrooms above the standard required relative to the number of people living in the house. This suggests that a significant proportion of existing large homes in the island are not being put to best use. So, a dwelling of 279 square metres or 3,000 square feet is big, over double the floor area of a standard 4-bed dwelling. These are luxury homes with a significant market value that is well beyond the reach of most islanders. For the purchase of a median-priced 4-bedroom house at 1.2 million in the fourth quarter of 2021 by a household with mean net income, the total deposit required was £752,000. A 3,000 square foot home will be bigger and cost substantially more than this type of house. So remember, policy SP3 says that new housing must reflect local housing need and market demand. The above analysis demonstrates quite clearly that demand for new housing is not for very large houses, but for smaller, affordable housing. Therefore, developing SPG that provides more detail on how this is achieved is entirely consistent with the Bridging Island plan and does not in any way constitute a new policy direction. In addition, policy H9 already says that new residential development in the countryside will only be permitted where the replacement dwelling is not larger than that being replaced in terms of gross floor space, building footprint, and visual impact. There is already a clear desire to shrink buildings in that category, in the countryside, in the policy. But there are still more ways in which policy H9A helps deliver the objectives of the Bridging Island plan. The 3,000 square feet guidance will only apply where a house larger than 3,000 square feet is being replaced. But there is an important qualification in the draft guidance. It's qualified. New buildings should be less than 279 square metres or 3,000 square feet gross floor space, except where the existing building is considerably larger. In other words, it is not the intention to try and shrink exceptionally large existing buildings down to 3,000 square feet. The question of what constitutes considerably larger will remain at the discretion of the decision maker, a planning officer, the planning committee, or if it goes to appeal or a public inquiry, with the minister. There is still room for discretion. And as with the density guidelines, I reinforce the point. These are one factor to be considered, these guidelines. They are not an instruction. They do not mandate. So, sir, the introduction of a size threshold for the development of new homes will help ensure that the homes that are provided during the Bridging Island Plan period better match the needs of islanders in terms of their size, use and affordability. And of course, as I've said, we already have a lot of very large houses. So there is no shortage of mansions for the very wealthy in this island. This is about making sure we better address housing need, adjust housing need where appropriate in the future to our demand. A final way, if you have got lost in all of that technicalities, to judge whether this SPG is in accordance with the Bridging Island Plan is to ask a rather simple question. What if I wrote the complete opposite to this SPG? What if the SPG said all buildings over 3,000 square feet must get bigger? That would clearly be in opposition to the Bridging Island Plan. That would not be allowed. The supplementary planning guidance I have developed does not say that. It says the opposite of that. It is entirely in keeping with the direction of travel in the Island Plan, and in particular bearing in mind that it is a supplementary piece of guidance to be read in conjunction with all other forms of all other items to be considered and subservient to the Island Plan. So a couple of other things I just wanted to tackle that were raised by Deputy Scott. It does seem to me that there are a number of diversionary points that have little to do with the amendment but seem to be leftover arguments from the Bridging Island Plan. Deputy Scott says that owing to ministerial priority, the introduction of this SPG leapfrogs other planning policy proposals. It's not true. There's no leapfrogging. The supplementary planning guidance will be developed over time. As I say, this doesn't subsume anything that's in the Island Plan in any case. In her letter to members, she wrote that there was an implication that parts of the island will remain at risk from insensitive development before SPG is developed. And I think that's flawed because the Bridging Island Plan actually provides a revised and strengthened planning policy framework to deal with planning applications throughout the island, where the impact of development on the character and sense of place of an area is now a key policy consideration where it wasn't before. In other words, there's no risks to the countryside because of the order in which I'm bringing forward this SPG. I note also from the letter sent round that some Portlet Bay apartments have been dragged into the argument. Wildly irrelevant. Those apartments were approved under the 2002 Island Plan, and the policy framework has completely changed since then. To give just one example, we now have a Skyline Vistas policy, which we didn't have at that time. Much is being made about this distinction between new policies and policies. This is a question of formatting as much as anything else. There is no established convention as to how SPG should appear or look. In other words, how I should present it. We framed this, Island officers, in this consultation as interim policies. That's the phrase we've chosen to use. It's not mandated. And given them policy numbers that relate to their parent policies in the Bridging Island Plan, simply for ease of reference in decision making. But they are not suddenly part of the island plan. They remain supplementary to the island plan. The fact that they have a numbering system that relates to something in the island plan does not give them the same legal status as the island plan. They remain supplementary. I might even consider changing that designation just to remove any confusion. An alternative might be to set the provisions of the SPG in various paragraphs and tables throughout the guidance, which might then be cited by reference to paragraph, page, and title and table numbers. There's other ways of doing that. At the moment, I think it's just cleaner and easier to do it this way. But remember, through all this SPG is supplementary, it doesn't become part of the island plan, and it's just one of the factors that decision makers will need to take into account. Notwithstanding any of these arguments, it is, of course, within the prerogative of this Assembly, our sovereign lawmaking body, to consider any matter it wishes. If it is the Assembly's wish to debate the SPG once it is finalised, then, of course, I will happily go through these points all over again. But it is worth remembering that the sovereign lawmaking body of this island is the body that both passed the Bridging Island Plan and has given me delegated powers to bring forward SPG. I would respectfully suggest that we move forward on that basis. It is my strongly held view that if this SPG effectively gets called in, it will achieve little whilst causing delay to other important pieces of policy development. Remember, the Bridging Island Plan remains the prime basis for decision making. That's why it's the Island Plan that gets a 9-day debate in this Assembly, whereas SPG is delegated to the Minister. This SPG is but one factor to help guide decision makers and all those attempting to navigate the planning system. And it is consistent with the direction of the Bridging Island Plan. I urge members to reject the proposition. Thank you.
Deputy Farn.
So I wonder if I may, before that, ask a question. Well, it may be a ruling from you, but it may be a question to the AG. SG, sorry. Sir.
Until I hear it, I won't be able to tell.
Yeah, I thought that might be the case. So it's just the wording of the proposition itself. It says, it's around the word implementation of the following policies, because we've had a lot of talk about redrafting the policy, but what's the legal implication of the word implementation? Are we just bringing back the decision that's made and talking about that? Does that mean legally? Or are we actually going to bring back the entire policy? Because I'm reading it so as not bringing back the entire policy, just bringing back the decision that's made using that policy. And a lot of the debate so far seems to me have been around something that I don't think is in this proposition. And that's the best way I can put that question across. Well, if I sit down, something else might come.
So the question that you're asking is the question for the Assembly as to whether it is bringing back for consideration the entire policy in each case, or any decision made under the policy. Is that
yes,
correct?
sir?
Because that would be individual planning decisions, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would indeed. And I think that's what we need to understand as to whether it's simply bringing back the implementation, as that word to me means, of a policy, rather than the policy itself, which has been agreed by this Assembly already. And I think that's a really important point, and I think there is a legal point there, because I know that the Bridging Island Plan has to be debated under a particular part of the law, I believe, sir. So it may not even be possible.
Well, if there is a legal question, that is a matter for the Solicitor General to advise on. If it is a matter of construction of the meaning of the proposition, that is a matter for the Chair to determine. So let's see what the legal answer is, and then I'll decide whether or not I need to say anything, which is always...
I did say I wasn't sure which one it was, sir, at the beginning.
No.
Yeah.
Did you have a point of clarification from the Minister? Well, should we hear the point of clarification first, and the Minister will have stopped speaking, and then the Solicitor General can give us the benefit of his advice.
I thought the Solicitor General may appreciate that time. So.
Yes, that of course still requires the Minister to give way if he chooses to do so.
Thank you, sir. I was just wondering if the Minister could clarify, in drawing up supplementary planning guidance and ultimately publishing it, does he go through a process of consultation with industry, with the affected sectors, before it is published? Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. The supplementary planning guidance is consulted on quite widely. I should have brought with me the statistics of the number of people who responded and so on. That will all be published so that the members will be able to see the extent of the consultation. The consultation was initially for 6 weeks. We were asked whether that could be extended. We offered to extend it to anybody who contacted us to 8 weeks so that there was time for people to respond. I know there was engagement explicitly with representatives of the development, if you can call it that, the development industry, construction sector, and so on. Obviously, states members were invited and indeed joined in large numbers meetings with me and relevant officers. So I think the requirement for consultation was very fully met, actually. Thank you for the.
So, sir, are you able to assist on the legal point raised by Deputy Rob Ward?
Well, I'll try to. I hope I don't confuse things further. I wonder whether there's a risk that we are using language perhaps more loosely than is necessarily helpful. The question, I think, is probably this. Is this supplementary planning guidance properly so called, or does it contain something which is not merely supplemental to, but is different from and marks a departure from the island plan? Ordinarily, one would expect an issue of that sort to be determined by a court on an application for judicial review, and certainly it happens in the English jurisdiction from time to time. So I hope members will forgive me if, with that in mind, I do make some points that I would be making on my feet in court if I were resisting such an application. Perhaps I can take policy H9 in the supplementary planning guidance to start with. It's at page 14 if members have it. Policy H9 was adopted by this Assembly, or rather the last Assembly, in the interim, the Bridging Island Plan. So this is a policy that's been adopted by this Assembly and has, as a consequence, a legal force behind it. And the policy is this: proposals for new residential development outside the built-up area will not be supported. So that's the policy. There should be no residential development at all outside the built-up area. And then there are caveats to the policy that are set out from points 1 through to 6, including at 3, the exception that development would represent optimal viable use of a traditional farm building where no alternative employment use is appropriate. So in other words, it's conserving buildings by allowing them to be redeveloped. At point 5, in the case of redevelopment of existing dwellings involving demolition and replacement, the replacement dwelling is not larger than that being replaced in terms of gross floor space and gives rise to demonstrable environmental gains. And then last in 6, the case of redevelopment of existing buildings in employment use involving demolition and replacement. It goes on to talk about there shouldn't be any greater size and there should be environmental gains. So the blanket policy, as expressed in the Island Plan, carries with it certain exceptions. So we then look at what is perhaps loosely termed interim policy H9A. Well, is it properly so called a new policy, or is it, as the author of the document suggests, and as the Minister has suggested, in fact in the nature of supplemental planning guidance? An interim policy H9A talks about large homes outside the built-up area, and it talks about there will be no residential development exceeding a certain floor space or square meterage, except in, again, limited exceptions 1 and 2. It seems to me a perfectly respectable argument to say that that in fact amounts to nothing more than a further explanation of the general prohibition on building residences outside the built-up area, because it provides a further supplemental explanation concerning floor space. And then it goes on to make caveats to that, exceptions to that 1 and 2, which closely mirror, if members have it open in front of them, caveats 1 and 2 closely mirror, in fact, caveats 3 and 6 of the general policy. So those are the sorts of arguments you might be thinking of making to resist a judicial review on the basis of Deputy Scott's argument. It seems to me that policy H2 housing density, the arguments are even clearer in favour of this being supplemental guidance, because H2 expressly and explicitly talks about development density in the built-up area. Now, if those two documents stand the test of being supplemental guidance, and that's not actually a matter for me, it's obviously a matter for members to consider in this debate, but if that is what they are, then it seems to me there is a fundamental problem as a matter of law with the proposition as drafted. For this reason, if I set the scene, under the planning and building law, Article 6 gives to the Minister and to the Minister alone an independent discretion as to whether he does or doesn't publish guidelines of this nature, provided that if he's going to issue them and before doing so, he consults any minister or statutory authority with an interest in the topic. The law gives to this Assembly no power whatsoever to direct the minister in the exercise of that executive power to adhere to directions given to the minister by this Assembly. The Assembly, in fact, has no power as a matter of law to order the minister to bring proposed planning guidance, supplementary guidance, before this Assembly in order to receive this Assembly's approval to publish it. So if the Assembly sought to act in that way, it would be, in my view, acting ultra vires, and that I take to be the fundamental problem. But as I say, it turns upon this question of whether this is properly supplementary planning guidance or whether it's in fact a radical departure from the Bridging Island Plan. I hope that's helpful.
I'm not sure, thanks to the learned Solicitor General, I'm not sure where that leaves the question that you were asking, Deputy Ward.
If I'm completely honest, neither am I. I think some of it does, actually, but thank you, sir, and thanks to the Solicitor General for that.
I mean, Solicitor, is it your advice that is for the Assembly to determine whether this is supplemental guidance or not? The supplemental guidance surely is a matter for statutory definition, and it's a matter of legal interpretation as to whether a particular document falls within the parameters. I'm
happy to be more robust then.
Well, it is entirely a matter for you. I can't tell you how to advise.
Given that supplementary planning guidance is susceptible to challenge by way of judicial review on the basis of the usual tests of irrationality, unlawfulness, and procedural irregularity. If I were advising a client or the minister in these circumstances, I would be advising him that I think a court would conclude that this was supplementary planning guidance and that it was not a new policy.
So what if the Solicitor General wasn't advising the Minister but advising Deputy Scott as a backbencher?
Sir.
Well, I think that the answer to that will be the advice is the advice. I mean, I think it was a form of words.
Sir.
Yes?
Please, may I just make the point that if this were an application for judicial review, that two sides of the case would be heard. And I just want to point out that there is a simple question in terms of a policy. Could you do something before that you couldn't afterwards as a result of the introduction of it? So I do believe in this particular case, could I build a house that was more than 3,000 feet or not as a result of this particular supplementary planning guidance, or which has been described as an interim policy? So whilst I very much respect the fact that the Solicitor General has very much considered this matter on their feet, I would respect you to bear this in mind so that the States Assembly can continue to debate this matter.
Do you have a further question for the Solicitor General? Because the matter of the way the Assembly functions is that we cannot resolve legal issues here.
Then I will
if you please let me finish and sit down for a moment, Deputy. The matter is that the only individual who provides legal advice to the Assembly, and it's a matter for the Assembly whether it accepts it or rejects it, but there is no other voice to provide legal advice. That will be one of the law officers, in this case, the Solicitor General. So what he says about the legal position is the definitive advice given by the Assembly. Whether members regard it or disregard it, it is open to any client to accept or disregard legal advice that's given at their own peril. But there is no other legal argument to be heard, and there's no way of determining any other legal argument. Now, is there something that you wish to add in terms of carrying this forward?
Thank you, sir. May I ask an additional question of the Solicitor General?
Yes.
The additional question I would like to ask is whether he would agree that there will be a difference on the ability of somebody who wanted to build a building of more than 3,000 feet as a result of the introduction of this supplementary planning guidance that supports the possible interpretation that it therefore should be regarded or could be regarded as a change in the content of the island plan of sufficient significance to say it is a change, could be regarded as a change of policy. Thank you, sir.
Is the question that the documentation before us, this particular policy, supplemental guidance, whatever you wish to call it at this point, restricts the ability of an individual to develop, and it provides. Sorry, that's
yes,
the point.
That wasn't there before.
That wasn't there before, and would that make it other than supplementary guidance? Where it consists?
Well, my advice doesn't change as to what I think the nature of these documents are, but supplementary planning guidance will usually be a relevant consideration for the decision maker as to whether or not to grant planning permission. Now, inevitably, if there is an express guidance to the effect that properties above a certain size should not be built, that will be a relevant consideration for the decision maker to have regard to. And it is likely in practice to make decision making in respect of those larger buildings perhaps easier for the decision maker. It doesn't follow necessarily that without this supplemental guidance, the decision maker's decision would have been different, because each planning matter falls to be considered on its own merits. It's not a black and white exercise. The planning officer has, in the exercise of his discretion, to come to the best decision he can in light of all the circumstances of the particular case, including whatever supplementary planning guidance is in existence.
Supplementary question, sir.
Yes.
Does the Solicitor General, could he please advise the Assembly in actually characterising supplementary planning guidance, and indeed when one looks at the content of the documents and describes the different forms in which it could take, that it could actually include policy?
Well, that's a hypothetical question. I can only repeat the advice I've given, which is that in my view, the better view is that these documents constitute supplemental planning guidance. I'm not sure I can add to what I've advised.
And the consequences of it constituting supplemental planning guidance?
Well,
for the purposes of this debate.
The consequences of it being supplemental planning guidance in terms of this proposition. Well, it's the one I've said, sir, which is that the proposition, couched as it is, it's saying that the States Assembly, the prior approval of the States Assembly must be sought before the implementation of what is supplementary planning guidance. It doesn't accord with the law. Article 6 of the Planning and Building Law gives to the Minister, not to this Assembly, an absolute discretion as to whether or not he will issue supplementary planning guidance. It does not give this Assembly any power to dictate to the Minister that he will or will not do so.
So, and I'm sorry to, if members will forgive me for having an exchange with the learned solicitor at this point, but I think this may help. It is the case, therefore, that your advice would be that if it is supplemental planning guidance, and you have advised that in your opinion it is, if the Assembly purported to approve the proposition, it would be approving a proposition that is directly at odds with the statutory provisions under which the supplemental planning was made. Do I characterise your advice correctly?
So you do indeed. If it simply invited the Minister,
yes,
then that would not be objectionable.
No. And the distinction the learned solicitor has made, and members were speaking, the distinction the learned solicitor has made, that many such propositions as members will recall, and certainly those in previous assemblies will see, invite or ask the minister to do a particular thing, but do not purport to direct him. But this is mandatory in its form, and mandatory in its form means that he has no discretion about it, and it will be directing him to act other than in accordance with the law, is what I understand the learned solicitor's advice to be. So I hope that clarifies it for members, but I'm only seeking to interpret what I believe I've been told, rather than to give original advice. Lots of lights on. Deputy Luce.
Thank you, sir. It's a point of order.
Yes.
Given what the Solicitor General's just told us, that we could be acting ultra vires, I've been trying to scan standing orders unsuccessfully, but is there a standing order that says we can't pass something through the vote on something that's ultra vires?
Trying to withdraw the proposition, but others have put their lights on. I should, yeah. No, our hands were tied, and I'll have to bring a proposition to change the law. Sir?
I think the position is that the Assembly can pass whatever proposition is put before it. The effect of that proposition, of course, is a different thing. The Assembly is competent to pass any lawful proposition, and by lawful I simply mean that don't go against the standing orders and the States of Jersey law. The consequences, however, may be that they are simply asking the Minister to do something he simply cannot or will not be able to do. That is a possible consequence, but that's outside, I think, the limit of the advice, certainly the limit of what I'm able to say as presiding officer. Deputy Scott.
Sir, on the basis of the advice of the Solicitor General then, and I apologise to States members for this, I feel that I need to withdraw the proposition because I cannot ask the Minister to act against the law. That is not reasonable. And I accept that perhaps I will need to take another proposition to ask for the law to be changed.
Well, you're entitled to ask the Assembly. As the debate is open, it can only be withdrawn with the agreement of the Assembly. But of course, you're entitled entirely to ask it.
Thank you, sir.
So I can do this informally. If we don't need to do it formally, do members agree that the proposition may be withdrawn? Yes. Very well. That seems to be NEMCON, Deputy Scott, and accordingly that proposition is withdrawn. The last item of public business is the draft.
So may I raise a point of order in relation to order? I think this is a genuine point of order. Members of the public and members will be finding it difficult to work out how we have arrived at a 2-hour discussion on something which was ultra vires, and I just would ask you to make not a ruling now, but whether or not we can avoid that in future.
Well, clearly that must be the case. Sometimes, although, as you'll know, Deputy, from your long experience in the chamber, from time to time, points of law come up, which makes it clear that there is a difficulty that had not been anticipated by everyone. One assumes that that the Minister had taken advice. One assumes that the Deputy had taken advice. Sometimes, however, the right questions are not always before the Assembly at the right time. And this is one such occasion in which clear result has come about as a result of a recent understanding of the legal position. Other than ensuring that advice is taken at an earlier stage and that any concern is placed before the law officers so that the Assembly will know in advance what the position of the law officers may be, then I'm not sure there's anything that I can reasonably say to encourage a different outcome. But if you think that there may be, I don't think, in other words, there's a ruling to be made about this. I think it's a matter of process. Certainly, in my experience in years gone by, when matters were of some complexity, the law officers were asked to and did file a written opinion before the Assembly, so the Assembly had the legal position before it. And that may be appropriate in certain circumstances, but obviously not for every single proposition. That would be, I think, unreasonable. I'm not sure I can assist further, however.
Obviously, I don't want to take the Assembly's up time again, but clearly there's an improvement to protection processes
Indeed.
because it would seem to me to be an open and shut case that this was not lawful.
Deputy Farnham, did you have a point of order, or?
Well, it was only to say, sir, previously it's not been unusual for ministers to be requested, or the States Assembly to request a minister to do something that's entirely up to the minister to do. And when that happens, it's normally the minister, sir, takes away a strong steer from the Assembly and acts accordingly. So it would have been, in my opinion, sir, for what it's worth. We could have continued with the debate, and whatever the result was, the minister was still able to carry on his own.
The matter's been
judgment.
withdrawn, and I think it was withdrawn on the basis that the actual terms of the proposition were not to request, but were mandatory. May not do so without. And I think the mandatory nature of that would have taken it outside the example you've brought to the attention of the Assembly. Very well. The next and final item is the draft Sea Fisheries TCA licensing of fishing boats amendment to law and regulations number 2, Jersey Regulations P115, lodged by the Minister of the Environment. Main respondent is the chair of the Environment, Housing and Infrastructure Scrutiny Panel. I ask the greffier to read the citation.
Draft Sea Fisheries TCA licensing of fishing boats amendment of law and regulations number 2, Jersey Regulations 2000. The states make these regulations under Articles 2 and 5A of the European Union Legislation Implementation Jersey Law 2014 and under Article 25 and 26 of the Sea Fisheries Jersey Law 1994.
Minister.
Sorry, sir, things have moved a little faster than I expected, and I've been searching back through my notes to find the relevant speech and indeed the right version of the speech, because there are sensitive issues involved in this matter. So I hope I don't cause a major diplomatic incident by blurting out something that I shouldn't. First, I would like to thank the Assembly for shortening the lodging period and allowing this proposition to be debated today. It is greatly appreciated, particularly as this relates to time-sensitive discussions with the EU and through them with our French friends. I'd also like to thank the Environment and Infrastructure Scrutiny Panel for engaging with the detailed content of the this amendment to regulations, and in particular for agreeing to meet at short notice on Monday to give me and officers a chance to deal with some of the issues in more detail. Members will see that I circulated a policy document to accompany the proposition. I apologise for the very late nature of that. It followed those discussions with Scrutiny on Monday, and it was felt by Scrutiny and by me that it would be helpful in the light of those discussions for that document to be scrutinised. I will refer to it later when I talk about this matter. The reason why all these documents are late is because we are engaged in a careful choreography here. These discussions are still ongoing with the EU about various matters to do with fishing, and the exact policies have not yet been agreed. In circulating the policy document that I have, I'm circulating policy that is not finalised, but we have considered this matter and decided that it is sufficiently well advanced and has not changed much in the last week or two, and therefore is probably a good basis on which members can judge the kind of policy framework I would be using in deciding replacement vessels. So let me, if I may, talk in a little more length about what it is I'm asking from the Assembly. Although short in length, the amendment is an important, indeed critical part of the overall implementation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I'm sure members of the Assembly will be aware that since the decision of the states to adopt P170 of 2020 in relation to the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, TCA, there have been lengthy, complicated and sometimes difficult discussions around implementing that agreement with respect to fishing opportunities. This is what is known as the extent and nature part of the fishing negotiations. I'm pleased to say that those discussions are drawing to a conclusion, and we can look forward to managing the stocks in our waters in a more systematic and thorough way than has been possible in the past, but also so as to provide some certainty and clarity to the fishing industry. The amendment before the Assembly today is with the amendment to regulations before the Assembly today is a necessary step towards achieving this. But first, let me step back and set the context. The TCA states that each party shall grant vessels of the other party access to fish in its water, reflecting the actual extent and nature of fishing activity that it can be demonstrated was carrying out during the period beginning on 1st February 2017 and ending on 31st January 2020 by qualifying vessels of the other party in the waters and under any treaty arrangements that existed on 31st January 2020. So there's a reference period, and we have to allow access to our waters to match the fishing effort that was undertaken during that reference period. In order to do this, amendments to the Sea Fisheries Jersey Law of 1994 and Sea Fisheries Licensing of Fishing Boats Jersey Regulations 2003 were brought forward by the previous Minister for the Environment and passed by the Assembly on the 23rd of April 2021. As a result of that, the number of qualifying vessels, both those French vessels that demonstrated fishing Jersey, if they could fish in Jersey waters, and Jersey vessels that demonstrated fishing in French waters, has been determined. And there are 136 French vessels with full licenses to fish in our waters, and you've got some more details on that in the document that I submitted or sent around earlier. So we've done licensing. Now we're in the second phase of discussions, with discussions related to the extent and nature part of the TCA. And as I say, these are now in their very final stages. This too has been a complicated process with discussions, both administrative and political, occurring locally, regionally, and with representatives from the UK, France, and European Commission. I would like to acknowledge with gratitude the work undertaken by Marine Resources officers, supported by colleagues in External Relations and the Law Officers Department in completing this task. The proposed amendment deals with one facet of the extent and nature process, that of replacement vessels. I'm going to use RVs, if people don't mind, just to avoid repeating the same phrase over again. Jersey's current RV process, replacement vessel process, as set out in the 1994 law, allows the minister to license a replacement vessel, which in that law is known as a substitute vessel, only where certain conditions are met relating to fishing type and characteristics of the vessel. The vessel must employ the same fishing method, known as métier, and be no greater in length, breadth, tonnage, and power than the vessel it's replacing. So that is the current situation. And this is this that I am seeking to amend. This causes a problem. The reason for that is this causes a problem. The TCA requires Jersey to maintain access to its waters by French vessels at a level fixed against that historical track record period that I mentioned earlier. To achieve this will require some flexibility to be considered as part of any replacement vessel scheme. This is down to practical realities. Consider this example. If you require a replacement vessel to be no greater in 4 different characteristics, length, breadth, tonnage, and power, the practical reality is that it is impossible to buy a new boat that hits all 4 characteristics exactly. You're just not going to find one off the peg that fits those 4 things exactly. So since no characteristic can exceed that of the old vessel, the reality is that some of those characteristics of the new replacement vessel will be lower. That means that cumulatively, over time, the size and power of the French fleet would reduce. That risks breaching the terms of the TCA, where we have to allow the French to maintain access with the same characteristics as they have during the reference period. The amendments which would be made by the draft regulations in this proposition would give the minister a degree of discretion in determining the issuing of a license for a replacement vessel. But the discretion must be based on the policy determined by the minister to give clarity to industry, to our foreign friends, and to administrators. So the issue here is discretion. Members may rightly ask, what is the policy on which this discretion would be based? Are we not just giving the minister a blank check? That is why I circulated the draft policy, which I'll explain in a bit more detail in a moment. As I said earlier, there is still a small chance that it will change, but the details seem to be pretty settled now. I think it's very important, first of all, to highlight what this proposition does not do. It does not allow for a vessel to increase what, when, and how it can fish in our waters. I know this issue has been raised by members of the industry, and I can assure the Assembly that I've considered this matter at length. Regardless of size, the fishing effort expended by a vessel, as well as the gears, the métier it may use, and the species it may target, is set out in the extent and nature aspect of the TCA. The issue of replacement vessels that is under consideration here deals with just this and not with other issues. So it is important that I'm clear and transparent in what I might mean by a degree of discretion when determining a license for a replacement vessel. As noted, I only have discretion within the guidelines of the policy. And a critical aspect of the policy is that it establishes a global ceiling for tonnage and energy power. The maximum capacity of the French fleet, when you add up all the boats, may not exceed this ceiling. This means that an increase in capacity by one vessel can only be accommodated if there is a similar reduction made to other vessels. But that's not all. Even within the global limit, the upper ceiling, if you like, there is a further restriction. The policy limits any increase in engine power and tonnage for vessels over 12 metres in length to a maximum of 10% and 20% respectively. The rules are slightly different for vessels under 12 metres, which must have a replacement that is that stays shorter than 12 metres and an engine power that is below 221 kilowatts. These restrict the degree to which any one replacement vessel may increase over its predecessor. I have agreed to consider as exceptional cases those vessels demonstrably replaced or commissioned, if properly evidenced, between February 2000 and December 2020. This is to accommodate replacement vessel decisions that were made before the TCA came into effect on 1st of January 2021. These vessels, which are very few in number, we think literally 2 or 3 at the moment, may benefit from increases in engine power and tonnage of up to 40% and 70%. However, a crucial factor is that when this replacement vessel itself comes up for renewal at some point in the future, it will be judged against the donor vessel, the original vessel, not the larger vessel. So how does this all come together? Could it lead to an increase in the capacity of the French fleet, perhaps to the disadvantage of our own fishing fleet? Let's look at an example. The owner of a boat of 13 metres, French trawlerman, let's say, wishes to replace his or her boat with one that is larger. Because it is over 12 metres in length, it will be bound by the part of the policy that says the new vessel will not be able to increase its engine power by more than 10% or its gross tonnage by more than 20%. But in addition to that, we have to consider the global limits, the total ceiling on tonnage and power. So the French fleet will have to find room within their global tonnage and horsepower limits to make way for the new replacement. They could do this by handing back the license of a boat, a different boat, or there might be headroom if a different owner has applied in the past for a replacement vessel that is smaller than the donor boat. Either way, the total tonnage and power of the French fleet cannot increase. I want to make one other thing clear. The proposition allows me, by ministerial decision, to vary the policy should it become necessary. That may make it sound as if I could turn around and abandon all these safeguards. Not so. First, this RV policy is part of an ecosystem of similar RV policies agreed by Guernsey, the UK, and also with the EU. It is, in fact, going to be, in large measure, reciprocal, so it will apply to our boats fishing in French waters as well. It isn't realistically possible for a minister to go rogue on this. But secondly, I'm very happy to give a commitment here that I would not make any changes to the replacement vessel policy without first taking them to scrutiny and consulting over them. So there might be those who would fear that these changes to the RV policy would still lead to an increase in fishing effort. After all, fewer, bigger boats are more efficient. They could catch more fish. That's where we have to bring back into the picture the extent and nature discussions that I mentioned right at the beginning. If you recall, the extent and nature discussions place limits on what the French fleet can catch. Again, the key is the reference period from 2017 to 2020. These limits are controlled by permits, which we issue. They're complicated, they're different for different boats, for different types of fishing, for different sized boats, and for the area in which the boats are fishing. But the overall headline is that those permits fix the total effort. This is the critical point. The combined effect of the RV policy and extent and nature is to break the link between the size and power of a vessel on the one hand and fishing effort on the other. In colloquial terms, it doesn't matter anymore how big a replacement vessel is, it still won't be able to catch more fish. And now perhaps members can see the importance of timing and why this is coming to the Assembly now. The EU side has wanted us to change the RV policy for some time. They have around half a dozen fishers, I believe, already, who for entirely legitimate reasons wish to replace old boats, and again, for very legitimate reasons, they would like them to have either to have a bit more power or be a bit bigger. But we have not wanted to change our RV policy until we had extent and nature agreed. That way we knew that slightly larger boats wouldn't be a problem, because we had control of our stocks through extent and nature. But not unreasonably, the French are now saying we're pretty well done with extent and nature. Now, where's the replacement vessel policy? They have been waiting for this change for some time. In fact, before Christmas, I turned down an application for a replacement vessel that would have fitted into this policy because we had not yet agreed, got to the position where I felt comfortable that we could do that. I think that it would be a good message to send to our French partners that we are serious about meeting our side of the bargain. This is why it's all coming together at the last minute. The choreography is important. So in summary, the Minister's discretion is clearly set out in the policy, enabling industry and administrations to understand and accommodate the flexibility offered in respect of replacement vessels. I have spent rather a long time going through the details, and you've listened to me rather a lot today. I hope I've managed to set members' minds at rest without sending them to sleep, and I would urge members, please, to support this proposition to amend the regulations.
Are the principles seconded?
Yes, sir.
Does any member wish to speak on the principles, Deputy Luce?
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to start right off the outset thanking the Minister for his speech in the opening of this debate. I wasn't quite sure, like he said at the beginning, how much he was going to be able to tell the Assembly. But for my mind, and I'm sure my panel's mind, he's certainly been very comprehensive in what he's told the Assembly today, and I hope members have been able to follow him and understand that, because fishing is the most complicated subject I've ever come across, and historically when I was involved with it, I found it took a huge amount of time and effort to understand the negotiations between not just the French but the Norman and Breton fishermen, negotiations with Guernsey, with the UK, with the European Union, and then negotiations inside the island with inshore and offshore fishermen, and fishermen that fished for different species and with different methods. And then came Brexit, and then we all knew the decision that was taken and the negotiations that went about to come up with the TECA, which really went on to the 59th second of the 23rd hour, and it was only at the very last minute that we knew what was happening on the paperwork. And it's been a bit like this with this policy. As members will know, the Minister lodged the proposition in front of us today on the 15th of December. That's not very many days ago. And within a week, scrutiny, my panel, Environment Scrutiny Panel, were meeting with the officers and the Minister to discuss that. And as the Minister has said, and I'm going to shorten my speech considerably because he said a lot of the things I want to, but if members have read the over 2,500 pages of the TCA, they will know on page 623, Article 502, states exactly what the Minister said, which was we cannot, we must allow the same amount of access for us to fish in our waters, reflecting the nature and extent that those boats and the effort they did within that reference period that the Minister spoke about. So, as I said, the panel met first with the Minister on the 21st of December, and we were told, amongst other things, about the replacement vessel policy, the one that exists at the moment, and as the Minister outlined, why it's been deemed to be too restrictive and needs to be changed. We spoke about the new policy, which I'm glad members have now had a chance to see because the Minister has circulated. And we spoke about the fact that the replacement vessel policy, as the Minister has said, is going to be very similar in France, in the EU, in the UK and in Guernsey, and that's important because many of these boats do not fish exclusively in our waters, but travel further afield. We spoke about licences and permits, and the importance, again, as the Minister has said, of these permits which will limit the amount of tonnage of a particular species any boat can catch, regardless of its size. We were told that what constitutes a day at sea was still to be defined, and we were told about satellite tracking of vessels and that every boat over 12 metres had to have a system fitted to it by the 1st of July last year in order that the Marine Resources Department can track where it was. And there was a lot more as well. We know, sir, that licences have been issued and need to be reissued. We know, as the Minister said, that permits certainly need to be issued, and many people are waiting for that to happen. And we know that a small number, admittedly, of replacement vessels, French replacement vessels, are seeking an approval in order that they can come into the French fleet. And there's a lot of pressure on all sides to move forward here. So my panel realises the importance of this relatively small piece of legislation, and we realise how vital it is to keep moving forward with this, and that it would be undesirable in the extreme for this Assembly to vote against it at this stage. However, we do feel that more information needs to be put into the public domain. I'm grateful for everything the Minister has told us today, but there's still a few small questions that we as a panel would like to ask. And the balance of what I'm saying here, I think, is that after we've approved the principles, which I very, very much hope we're going to do, is that my panel will call this in, if only to the next sitting, because we promise to move this forward just as quickly as we can. That will only add a single week to the desired date of the 1st of February. But hopefully, in calling it in, we can have a very short time to deliver the additional information that we feel states members and the public should have. And at that time, sir, the next sitting, that we can move forward. So I'll leave it there and allow others to speak on the principles. Thank you, sir.
Very much, Deputy Scott.
So very much would like to thank the Minister for the Environment for the work he's done so far on this, on the regulations and the policy that supports it. And indeed thank the Minister for External Relations for calling me at, well, perhaps I don't quite thank him, as much as I can, for calling me at 8:30 quite late night, the other night, just to try and delay some of my concerns about it. I also want to thank the Environmental and Infrastructure and Housing and Infrastructure Scrutiny Panel for looking at this issue in such depth in a very tight timeframe. And I respect the decision they're taking because I certainly haven't quite got my head around, we've been talking about following the letter of the law, and I've been hearing about the letter of the law when it comes to the tech regulations and about replacement vessels, but I'm also hearing about a policy that actually allows larger vessels to some extent within a certain percentage to replace some of these boats in the fishing fleet, and with some sort of reference to technology, bearing in mind that generally as we progress towards the future, we tend to find that technology helps smaller vessels become more and more powerful, efficient, these sort of things, smaller things, and being very mindful of the way in which catch is perhaps monitored. So I thank my members on the Environmental Scrutiny Panel for endeavouring to get to the bottom of this.
Very much. Deputy Joseph.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I would like to also add the Environment Minister's thanks to the Assembly for its permission for what is a shortened lodging period and debating this matter today. The Minister has explained in a way that I certainly couldn't the complexity of the licence arrangement and fishing. And Deputy Luce will remember when I discharged Environment and Public Service as a farmer's son, I found it pretty difficult to understand fishing matters. As External Relations Minister, I have been working for Jersey, for the Environment Minister, in the negotiations in relation to the issuing of the licences and permits that the Minister didn't, I don't think, say, but he may in his concluding remarks explain clearly, expire on the 31st of January. This, in other words, in a few couple of weeks' time. So access for Jersey fishermen in our waters with licences and permits expires unless the Minister does something to extend those licences. And there has been a huge amount of debate which has had to be choreographed and brilliantly choreographed by the Minister's Department, assisted by External Relations, with DEFRA, with Brussels. Members will know that I met personally and have had 2 online calls and letters exchanges just yesterday with Commissioner Sintovicius in Brussels, and I also met the Secretary of State, Minister for the Seas in Paris just before Christmas. There has been a big to and fro on whether or not boats qualify within the period that the TECA agrees. In other words, can they prove to have fished in waters and therefore which gives them the right to have a licence? And without going into an awful lot of detail, there's been a lot of discussion with these parties where obviously the French fishers want to have as much ability to fish in our valuable waters as possible. But they have to, and by right, as the Minister and Deputy Luce has said, they have to prove that effort by virtue of being able to prove either by satellite, there's something also called ping, which I tried to get my head around in terms of 2 reference points, whether or not they have fished in Jersey waters in the relevant period in order to get a licence. And it has been very difficult for those discussions and negotiations, which French fishers, are applying to the Minister in Jersey for a right to fish in our waters. I can say to members that we are now, hopefully, finally, at a conclusion for those issuing of those licence and permits. Those licence and permits require, as the Minister has explained, and the Deputy Luce has also confirmed, are the effect of bringing into a policy effect, effectuating the policy that was set out in the TECA. Replacement vessels, and what we're talking about here, is the legal ability for the minister to allow replacement vessels. The previous debate was talking about a legal ability for planning matters and then a policy. The policy is a matter for the minister. And so what the scrutiny panel, and I'm not sure, I don't want to play any political overstatements, but it is, from external relations point of view, absolutely vital that the Minister for the Environment can issue licenses and permits by the 31st of January, and that French fishers have the confidence that those licenses are going to be able to be continued to access Jersey waters, and that does mean that some of those licenses are going to apply for replacement vessels, etc. I know that there has been some lobbying of members by fishers in Jersey and others that are suggesting that this means effectively an open door. The Minister's explained it quite clearly, and the Minister has been absolutely clear, and he is a Minister in touch with his brief, and I've been trying to explain the high-level issues and make sure that the effectiveness of the parties, and I don't want to go into the detail which the Minister has. And I would say to the Assembly that there was a very, very serious reason why the Minister and the Council of Ministers wanted this legislation passed by the Assembly today. It is the legal ability to grant a replacement vessel, and the terms of we're only dealing with the principles, but if we went on to the articles, we would then go on to examine what effectively is a replication of TCA, and there's all sorts of legal provisions in there which replicate what is in the TCA, etc. And so it's quite restricted. And then it's further discretionary under the policy, which the Minister has also circulated to States members. I would be concerned, as this Assembly's External Relations Minister, if we did not complete the legislative process for granting the Minister the licensing ability before the end of January. And I understand why a number of members are concerned about whether or not they should be scrutinising the regulations. And I would ask the Minister, in his summing up, because this debate is going to be halted and we're not going to get to the regulations, whether or not, because scrutiny said they're going to call it in, which is their right, and I completely respect the democratic right of the scrutiny panel to do so, but as External Relations Minister, I would have to say that I don't quite understand whether or not it is the policy which is the discretionary part, and we've learnt, members have learnt a lot about policy this afternoon because of the debate we've had previously about policy versus law in the Island Plan debate. And the scrutiny panel, it seems to me, and I say this incredibly respectfully, it seems to me that they want, quite rightly, to understand the way that the law, which could be passed today, and the regulations are then going to be put into policy effect by the Minister. And I would just invite, and there's only been the Minister speaking and the Chair of the Scrutiny Panel speaking, and I just invite the Minister and any other members of the panel to consider very carefully whether they are wanting to scrutinise the policy, which is the addendum which has been provided by the Minister, which can only take effect when the legal provisions are there, or whether or not it's the regulations themselves, which are effectively mandatory because they're lifted from the TECA. I'm trying to explain something very complicated in most simplistic language, because there's a three-stage process. There is the principles of a law, then there are the regulations which sets out some more detail, and then there's how you actually implement it, which is the policy. The policy is the ministerial decision that the Minister will make under ministerial powers. And he has accepted that he is prepared to not only, he's published the plan, he's not only prepared to publish the plan and use that plan and then bring that matter to scrutiny if he wants to change it. I know, and I completely have confidence in the Sea Fisheries Department and the External Relations team and the incredibly difficult negotiations that have been underway. And I recall to members the last time we were unable to sort out fishing licences. Members will recall what happened, and I'm not suggesting at all that this will happen again, but I want this Assembly, or I invite this Assembly, to give certainty and confidence about the Jersey position and this Assembly's position about implementing the TECA and the consequences of issuing French fishers in Jersey waters. At the same time, it should be said that we should also be thinking about local fishers, and I was very pleased that the Minister for Economic Development indicated the importance of local fishers, because this law is mainly going to be used, and we're talking about it because of the issuing of licences of French vessels in our waters. And so I'm sorry to take the Assembly's time, but I do wish to raise very, very seriously and respectfully the issue of a legislative arrangement and a law that allows the Minister to do something, and then how he wished to implement it, and invite the scrutiny panel to consider whether they wish to take the undertaking of the Minister about the policy, which is the addendum to the report, or whether or not it's the regulations themselves. Because I think the regulations, as far as I've understood them, are basically what they are, and they are mandatory, and it's not really subject to further more discussion and couldn't be changed. It's actual policy which is under debate, which some people have been concerned about. I have a 10-minute limit, isn't it, for speeches? 15. I don't really want to speak. I try to speak for just 10 minutes. And I just, I'm taking time of the Assembly because the Minister for the Environment the Minister and I work together on what is an incredibly difficult area, and which is a very complex area. And getting it wrong has big implications for reputation. And I can say to the Assembly, the reputation of Jersey, the standing of Jersey as being a trusted, proper jurisdiction that respects its obligations under the law is good because of the interactions we've had both at national level. I don't think any member of this Assembly has met before a Minister of State in France in their office. I met two just before Christmas, the Secretary of State for Europe and the new Minister of the Sea. And I'm expressing to them that we will do the right thing, and we are a responsible jurisdiction that will abide by the TECA provisions. Moreover, I'm not also afraid to tell them what I expect them to do in return. And that's why I've been absolutely clear that as far as our local fishermen are concerned, I am not happy, and this island is not happy, of the port closing times that we experienced, which prevented our fishers, which is not the subject of this debate, but is tangential in the general negotiations of diplomacy, that we had effectively our Jersey fishermen not being able to land their catch in Normandy and Granville. And there are other issues of ministerial arrangements, which I won't talk about because it's not this subject, but it's tangential. I am engaged carefully with the Minister and the Economic Development Minister, and in other ministers as well, in careful negotiations, in diplomacy, in getting what we want from our French counterparts for our island community. And I want to be able, for this Assembly, I encourage this Assembly, subject to democratic processes and all the rest of it, subject to all of that, to ensure that I can go out from this Assembly with the support and the endorsement of the Assembly to go out to continue to ensure that we get from our French neighbours what we need. And that does mean making decisions properly, within law, within timeframes. And members know that negotiations about things to do with Europe go to the wire. And it is true that the discussions which underline the Minister's requirement to have this replacement vessel voters have gone up to the wire. I had an email only yesterday from Brussels about some of the detailed, complex natures of this, of the proofing of the fishing of sea. And I have to say, I can't say certainly, but I can say that the Minister is, Jersey is well advanced of being able to solve once and for all, and that means that the Minister's done the right thing to protect access for Jersey water, of French fishermen in Jersey waters. That means giving them what they can prove to have been done before and that they can continue on, which is the legal obligation of the TECA. So the External Relations Minister says to the Assembly very politely, please can we continue with the legislation which gives the Minister the right for replacement vessels so he can issue those licences by the 31st of January with the ability to get replacement vessels for those licences. If we don't do that, I think there's a risk, unless we have to go back and explain why we haven't done the legal right to have replacement vessels, which was in the TECA. I'm not going to criticise the last government. I'm not going to criticise anything at all, but we are where we are. We didn't have it. We should have had it. We need it. And I need the Minister, for my own negotiations with France, to be able to issue licences and get this over and done with so we can get on and ask and then say, look, we've done that. Now we want this. Because there are things we want from France, and I want a better deal for our fishermen in Granville, in St Malo, and in lots of other areas. And I'm not going to speak anymore, sir, because time is running out. I don't really want to spend long time on speeches, but I really urge the Assembly to consider the difference between scrutiny of legislation and policy. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Deputy Balash.
So one of the few advantages, to my mind, of acceding to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was the change that it brought about by allowing Jersey, or the Minister for the Environment specifically, to regulate fishing in our own territorial sea. That was a significant and major change, and it seems to me that it ought to be reflected in the legislation. And I was puzzled to look at the amendment to Article 7 in this law, Article 7.2J, which states that regulations may provide that a person or authority who may grant a licence under this law must do so only, and then it sets out the provisions. My question for the Minister is, why does this not say the Minister? Is there anybody else who can issue a licence under this law? And if so, who is it? And if the Minister's answer to that question is in the negative, there is nobody else, it is the Minister. I hope that, particularly if it's going to be called in by scrutiny, there might be time to give some consideration as to whether this minor change might be made to the drafting to make it clear on the face of the law that Jersey regulates its own territorial sea and the Minister has this responsibility.
Very much, Deputy. Deputy Catherine Curtis.
Thank you, sir. During the election period, I met with the chair of the Jersey Fishermen's Association because I believe in our traditional industries, and we have since consulted with them on this matter. They don't agree to these regulations as they are currently worded. They are the experts on fishing. It's vital for our fishing industry and for our food security and for environmental sustainability that the replacement vessel scheme does not allow for larger replacement vessels. High impact, powerful foreign vessels licensed by Jersey force our small-scale boats out of traditional areas to compete with much bigger foreign vessels. I urge members to properly consider our own Jersey fishermen and to remember that we are their representatives in government. I'm pleased to hear this is being to being called in by scrutiny for further consideration. Thank you.
Deputy Lally. Deputy Lally?
Thank you, sir. I realise that it's required huge amounts of diplomacy to get to this stage, and it's still a very delicate situation, and there are still some issues to resolve, not least for our own fishermen. I would just like to make the point, and as scrutiny have called it in, it seems like an opportune time to raise this issue. And that is about the scope, what scope we have to restrict the size of vessels in our waters. Now, the Minister sent round a very helpful note to say that there were 29 vessels over 12 metres, French vessels that have been licensed. So there are 29 French vessels in our waters. I believe, very sadly, that there is now only one Jersey vessel whose size is over 12 metres in our waters. And I happen to know that fisherman, and I know that he would consider being bought out should it, if it came to that. So I would like scrutiny and the Minister to have a look at this issue, because if we restricted our own fleet to 12 metres and under, if we could then say that our fishing ground is for vessels under 12 metres, and that would restrict the 29 French vessels of over 12 metres, because it does concern me if they are doing environmental damage. It does concern me that there are issues with our own fishermen, and I would like some assurance that our waters are being protected to the full extent for our own fishermen and environmental grounds. So I welcome the Minister's comments on this, but I would really like scrutiny to have a look at this particular issue. Thank you, sir.
Very much, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the principles? Deputy Tanier.
Thank you, sir. It's a shame that Deputy Joseph had to finish at 15 minutes and 5 seconds, and I've always said that the time limit is undemocratic, because I'm sure he had much more to say that was more interesting. In fact, he might have started to say something which I think would have informed me about why we might want to vote for this today or to object to the pulling in of scrutiny. What I heard, though, sir, is what I think was a lot of talk about the general Brexit, post-Brexit negotiations, our general relations with Europe, and a lot of the secretaries of state that the Minister has met. But it's in stark contrast to the meeting we had with the head of the Jersey Fishermen's Association, I think it's called that, or the Jersey Fishers Association, which I thank Deputy Curtis for arranging for us. And I know that, as she said, she's been in long correspondence with them from the election up until now to listen to what they've got to say to understand it. And I think, as Deputy Luce quite rightly said, none of us necessarily profess to be experts in this area, so it's really important to listen to those who've got experience, not at the coalface, but at the sea front in that respect. And the first thing is that I think we need a reality check, is that we hear expressions saying that we've now got more control of our own waters, and that this law is giving the Minister more power to basically control and regulate fishing in our waters. Well, more control than what? Because, as we know, we had a very good agreement called the Bay of Granville Agreement, which was negotiated directly, effectively, between Jersey, with coordination with Guernsey, and our French counterparts. And that was seen as working very well. And we know that's changed. And it has to be said that, ironically, post-Brexit, well, Brexit was all supposed to be about taking back control. We didn't have a say in it, of course. We're innocent bystanders, if we can call it that. It was about taking back control. And also, I think it was sold to the fishermen and fishers about taking control of the water. And we find ourselves in the opposite position, where actually we don't have control of our waters anymore, because the theory is, I would say, potentially very different from the realpolitik. And I think there are those in some quarters who believe that actually ministers locally will simply acquiesce to whatever they are asked for, whether it's by, in some cases, in different areas, by the British government or by the French in this case. And I think there are serious questions that need to be asked. And so I was alarmed by a couple of things. First of all, we do have a parliamentary process that should be respected, and it's there for good reason. The first thing is that this lodging time has already been reduced so that we can debate this today. So if the Minister for External Relations is concerned about sending the wrong message out to the French, for example, he doesn't need to. He and his government have already done something which is cutting corners on the parliamentary process to make sure that this can be debated earlier than it should have been. Secondly, is that ministers should presume that all legislation that they bring to the Assembly will be called in. We have first, second and third readings for a reason, and it's far too often that those happen all at the same sitting within a space of an hour, sometimes within a space of minutes, without necessarily a recorded vote, let alone a debate. Some of these are done on a standing vote. And so when a scrutiny panel, and I think they've been very diplomatic and measured so far in what they've said, say we would like to bring this in for some scrutiny so that we know more about the policy that's behind it, so that we can perhaps measure and test what we've been told by ministers against the policy line by line, and also what we've been told by local fishers who are at that seafront with the dealing with this, that they can come back in short order, and I think that has to be respected. So I would simply say to the Minister, I think he's done what he's required to be doing. And I was also slightly alarmed by the word, did anyone else pick up on it, choreography, from the Environment Minister. He said that the choreography here is very important. I'm not quite sure what that means. Are we here to pass robust and well thought out legislation, or are we here to perform a piece of theatre, presumably for the benefit of the French authorities who might be listening to what we're doing? This isn't a pantomime, if we're going to talk about choreography. This is about real politics and what we're passing, making sure it's fit for purpose. Now, speaking in personally here, we know that we have to always balance two things, I think. Fundamentally, is fish stocks. That's what this all boils down to. Now, many scientists believe that if we carry on globally as we are, in 25 years, there may not be any meaningful amounts of fish in the sea. So both in terms of ecology, but also in terms of economy, that is a very serious position to be in. Why is it then we have a piece of legislation here which allows the largest vessels to increase by 10%? There's a presumption that, and who has the largest vessels that fish in our waters? Is it the Jersey fishers, is it the Jersey vessels, or is it the non-Jersey vessels? Apart from one exception, which we've been told about, and I think, personally, we need to be moving away from large vessels. We need to be moving away from trawlers. We need to be moving away from any kind of vessel which can put perhaps miles and miles of nets out and leave them there for days on end, which I've been told can even take a week to get them all back in, whether they're catching spider crab or whatever. This is not a sustainable métier that we should be promoting. Métier is a good French word, I think, in this case. And if we carry on like this, it's not good for the planet, it's not good for the oceans. And secondly, we need to then balance that against who gets the benefit, quid bono. Who gets the best side of this deal? It's not the Jersey fishing fleet, it's potentially the French fishing fleet. So let's look at it. A large trawler, which maybe operates in the North Sea, might be capped at 2,000 horsepower. So some of the vessels we get in our waters from the French side, and possibly one of the Jersey ones, might be in the region of 1,000, 1,500 horsepower, which is big. Now, if you increase a vessel which is 12 metres more in terms of its horsepower by 10%, say if it's 1,500 horsepower, you're putting an extra 150 horsepower on top of that. Well, that increase is bigger than perhaps one boat that goes out and does more sustainable fishing in local waters already. And who's going to win? This idea that having bigger boats doesn't automatically mean that more fish will be caught, I think is not credible, sir. Because the whole point of having a bigger vessel and applying to upgrade your vessel is because you can catch more fish. And there is a paradox that the bigger the vessel you have, the higher your running costs. So it becomes cyclical. You have to spend more time at sea, you have to employ more staff, and you have to ultimately catch more fish, which other fishers are not going to be catching themselves. So it leaves, ironically, to a surplus in stock, which then drives down fish prices, and it doesn't help anyone in the long term, and it certainly depletes fish stocks. So that in itself, I think, is a good reason that these things can be looked at in the round, and why I welcome the scrutiny panel calling this in. Now, personally, I don't know if one session is enough for the adequate scrutiny that needs to be done into these issues being brought forward, but they've told us that it is sufficient time, and so I don't need to make the case for that because they're allowed to do that. But we certainly shouldn't be morally judging them or putting pressure on the scrutiny panel to do the work that they should be doing. They would be remiss if they weren't doing that work any, sir. So as it stands, I do remain open-minded. I do appreciate this is a nuanced negotiation. I do accept that at the same time, we've always had to respect the historic rights of French fishers who have operated in our island. And I also accept that a lot of the licenses that are currently being issued may not be being used, and they may never be used. It's simply something for potential vessels. But I do think there are lots of gnarly issues, if you like, that need to be resolved and looked at by the scrutiny panel. And I think I think what the fishers have been telling us themselves, I don't think we should be dismissing so quickly in this.
Thank you very much. Connie Tyberson-Pollard.
Thank you, sir. I'd first of all say that our duty as scrutineers is to our own Jersey fishing fleet, and that has to be our primary concern, and that is the reason why we're considering taking the proposition in. I would also say, sir, that one of the reasons I think we have to, and I'm very grateful for the Minister and his team for a comprehensive presentation to us, but we haven't taken the Jersey fishing fleet with us. We haven't taken fishermen and fisherwomen with us at all. And this is the problem, as I see it, which needs to be resolved. We have to look after our fleet and do what we can to help them. It's been decimated since Brexit, and we have to reverse that direction of travel. I'm fully versed with the needs and requirements for replacement vessels. I've been in the marine industry all my life, and there will be variations needed. There will be increased sizes due to availability of boats, of molds, and so on and so forth, engines, and there has to be a little bit of accommodation for that. And the framework put forward is probably where that will have to go. That said, there's been no mention in the debate, and I don't think the Minister alluded to it at this point, the fact that it is the permits that will regulate the amount of fish caught, and that's an extremely important point. Now, and it may be down to the mechanisms of how this is being dealt with, what one is feeling is that there is a question mark over the adherence of French fishermen to the proposed permits, which are not in place yet. Now we understand there will be significant technology available to our team at Marine Resources to be able to monitor this. We are not really confident that the French will adhere, and I think we need to have some words of confidence. I look to the External Relations Minister to pick up that point. We need confidence that those permits will be adhered to, because without them, our fleet is dead, quite frankly. And the proposal that, the figure of 1.3 tonnes of scallops a day is really quite pertinent. At the moment, that's not really being measured anywhere. We're certainly not measuring it here. And we don't really want to lose track. So it is an exchange. The agreement for the replacement vessel policy has to be exchanged fairly with this permit allocation. And I think that's probably where we need to go. But as scrutineers, we'll be looking to try and take the fishing industry with us the best we can, sir. Thank you.
Deputy Morell.
Thank you, sir. Deputy Tadyer, in his speech, said that the Minister, government, others, people except him, needed a reality check. I'd put it to the Assembly that the only person here who needs a reality check is Deputy Tadyer, sir. Because this isn't a matter of choice. The Assembly actually doesn't have a lot of power in this area, and Deputy Tadyer knows that. This is entirely a result of the UK's folly with Brexit, the poorly negotiated by the UK trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, which we were then, as many members who were here in the last Assembly will remember, I was trying to scrutinise on Boxing Day because we got that agreement, or perhaps we got it on Boxing Day, so I started my scrutiny immediately at home without any resources, because that's all there was, going through everything that I could as quickly as possible as chair of the Economic and International Affairs Scrutiny Panel. That agreement, incredibly poorly negotiated by the UK, which is causing problems in Northern Ireland, it's causing problems in Jersey, it's causing problems everywhere. It is that agreement which is tying the hands of the Environment Minister and the External Relations Minister, and ultimately this Assembly. Now, the chair of the Jersey Fishermen's Association can want all he wants. I do still remember him saying that he supported Brexit. Well, unfortunately, this is the result of Brexit. The trade and cooperation agreement with the EU basically states that we have to maintain the same levels of fishing by the French in our waters as happened before the UK left the EU. That means we have to let them into our waters. There's no question. We cannot, as an Assembly, change that. We can rail against it. We can listen to the chair of the Fishermen's Association telling us how much he doesn't like it. Well, that's the Brexit that he supported. That's the Brexit that he wanted. It took control away from us in so many ways. We had the Bay of Granville Agreement, which, if I'm correct, Deputy Tadyer did not involve Guernsey. It was just Jersey. It's a tripartite agreement. And between Jersey, the UK, and France, not Guernsey. And that was imperfect. And I know Sir Philip, Deputy Balash is very aware of its imperfections, but it was something to work with. It was difficult at the time to work with, and that's where the frustration came from the fishing fleet at the time. And there were absolutely, as I understand it, speaking to people over the last few years, there was an intransigence on the part of Normandy and Brittany fisheries to adapt to some of the things that Jersey would have liked. And that made it very difficult. But where we have landed, whilst giving us a semblance of control, has also taken away control from us fully. I entirely respect the right of the chair of the Environment Panel to call in this item. He's been incredibly good in saying that the panel will work on it as quickly as possible. And I have no doubt that he understands, having spoken to him many times about the implications of Brexit and fishing and others, he will understand that we are limited in what we can do. So Deputy Curtis, Catherine Curtis, can talk as much as she likes about the things that we should be doing for fishing, but our hands are tied by a poorly negotiated agreement, by a poor decision by the UK that is affecting us daily. It affects our fishermen daily, it affects us daily, and there's not a lot we can do about it. So I speak passionately, one, because Brexit almost always triggers me, and that's just the way I am. I'm still not over it. But also because, for me, the right way for us to deal with this piece of legislation is exactly as Deputy Luce is doing. He is been briefed by the Minister. He believes, and his panel believe, they need to do a bit more work on it. They will do their work, and they will work with the Minister to ensure that they are happy with where we end up. But as an Assembly, we are not able to actually change this. We could pass a proposition saying Jersey's waters are for Jersey only. We could pass that proposition today. It would mean nothing. It would do nothing. Because our hands are tied by international law because of that poorly negotiated agreement by the UK. So please, as an Assembly, understand this. We do not have choice in this matter in the way that we would like to think we do. We cannot give the Jersey fishermen everything that they would like because of Brexit, because of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Now, we could have decided on those days around Christmas in 2020, we're going to 2021 at the time, we could have decided not to sign up to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That was the only option. We had a choice. We sign this agreement, we don't sign this agreement. We could have chosen not to sign that agreement, in which case we would absolutely be able to say Jersey's waters for Jersey boats only, everyone else can go away, no one's allowed in our waters. That would have given us that ability. We didn't do that because it would not just have allowed us to restrict Jersey's waters to Jersey fishing. It would also have meant that we would have had customs barriers between us and the UK. It would have also meant that basically every item coming to Jersey, where 98% of our goods come from, would have had to be checked and stopped, and everything going in the opposite direction would have been exactly the same thing. So Jersey's supply lines, which people talk about at the moment a great deal with concern, had we decided not to go down the road of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, Jersey's supply lines would have been ruptured immediately. So when people talk about resilience, that was something the Assembly did in order to ensure the resilience of the island's basic supplies. The cost was that our hands, one of the costs, there were many costs, one of the costs was that our hands with regard to fishing were tied. Now, that cannot be changed. We all talk to the chair of the Jersey Fishermen's Association. We all know his views on this matter. But his views are not compatible with the poorly negotiated agreement which we effectively had to sign up to. That's unfortunately the truth. So, yes, please, as an Assembly, we must support this proposal, because to do otherwise would end with us being in breach of international law. It would then bring the UK looking round, wondering what we're doing. That would threaten our autonomy. That would be a serious matter, a much more serious matter than the fishing matter that is before us. Let scrutiny do its work properly, and I have no doubt, because Deputy Luce is aware of these implications, that he and the panel will do it properly. But let's stop pretending that there is another world, another reality in which Jersey can control its waters completely. That reality doesn't exist. It will only exist if we withdraw from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the UK. That might be something that we would want to do, but that would be a very interesting debate that would be, I'd expect, called in by almost every scrutiny panel, because we would need to look at that very closely. But that's the only world in which we get full freedom over our seas. And I just hope the Assembly begins to understand that. Thank you, sir.
Deputy Ward.
Thank you, sir. It's good to follow Deputy Morell and his Brexit passions, if I can put it that way, sir. Because I agree with him on so many points, and the implications of Brexit, I think, are only just being seen, the reality. And let's talk about reality. I've got to say a few things about what was just said, though, and I give in. And I mean, I'm not going to criticise for someone being passionate in their views, but I don't think the Jersey Fishing Association's position is to say Jersey fishermen only in Jersey waters. I don't think they've ever said that. I think their concerns. I think their concerns really, and this is what we're talking about. We're talking about this amendment, which is the replacement vessel scheme. And there have been some genuine concerns there. Now, just go back to what we talked about earlier today. And one of the reasons that a proposition was brought to this assembly is that people believed that on the doorstep they spoke to people who had a concern. Now, we can't do that in one part of our day and then dismiss the concerns on the later part of our day of the Jersey Fishing Association and Jersey Fishers on our island. Okay? But we debated it and we listened to it and we went through it, and those were very important to do that. And there is, to some extent, right, there's not a lot we can do. We have to give access to our fishing waters to the French fishing fleet. We get that. But the concerns are the process of replacement vessels. And I've got to say, it has not helped when the External Relations Minister puts all of this together in one bucket, one net, one might say, and says that, you know, we can't do this. If we don't do this, we won't have any licences and everything will fall in. And we get into this catastrophe politics again. And I think what it takes is a bit of a calmer head than that. It takes a calmer approach, which is what we need, is to say that we understand the issues that are being faced, but we need to take on board the concerns of the fishing industry if we're going to get them on side. Because the Jersey fishing industry has seen a decline in those boats that are out fishing. That is the reality. And it's happened since Brexit. And the concerns are these, and this is the detail, and I've got to go back to something the Minister said, and it's trying to be proper, but this is proper debate to some extent, I think. The words were probably a good policy to judge the kind of basis. And those words they lack a definite that I think that people are looking for in the fishing industry. The words probably and the kind of basis we have had, and details seem to be settled. And it's that uncertainty that is causing the problem for those who go out and fish every day. Because they have a concern. So for example, sir, with a larger boat, even the slightly larger boat, and I've had an exponential learning curve when it comes to fishing, it does change the time when you can go and fish in rougher waters. So you may be able to access fishing grounds when they couldn't before. And that gradual change over time is the concern that's being expressed to us. So it's not about what happens next year even, or the year after, on those few boats that are going to be have replacement vessels now. It's the implication in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Will there be a fishing industry at all? Or will we look back on this piece of legislation or this amendment and say, actually, we can pinpoint where we allowed this change, and then we can pinpoint and track through where we are today, which was effectively now to really not have a fishing industry on this island. Now, that's a genuine question. That's a genuine concern. Do I know the answer to that? Of course I don't know the answer to that. I don't think we do. But that's what needs to be discussed. And I think that's why in scrutiny we want to look again and give that a little more time. And the lodging period was reduced. It was actually lodged for the next time, so it wasn't actually going to be any later than when we started. But we would undertake some looking at this in short order and put the time into that. And I've got to say as well, there are some other issues that have arisen, and I'll choose my words carefully, sir, in terms, there was announced a £300,000 industry just yesterday, for the fishing industry, which is a real coincidence that we're discussing this and this change now. But that comes with a lot of strings attached. And even at that point, speaking to the Jersey fishing industry as we did, there was concern over, well, actually, that money is linked to us and sustainability and fishing less, and if you like, having more control over the Jersey fishing fleet. But that isn't being seen in the French fishing fleet at the same time, where actually they'll keep the same tonnage or that combination of factors, that overall fishing capacity. I think that's the wrong word, but I think the Minister knows what I mean. We've spoken about it quite a lot. But at times it will change the nature of that. And by changing the nature of that, it could change the nature of that fishing. And it could put the Jersey fleet at a huge disadvantage. And that is the question that is causing the concern. And if you are certain that that isn't going to happen, then fine. But if you're not, you need to be very wary of what we're voting on today, particularly when we're, if you like, our arm is twisted a little as we go through this debate. And of course, that's the nature of debate, you're trying to convince people. But there's ways to do that. And that's the concerns that have come from the debates for me today, as well as the scrutiny panel. And we've listened to quite a lot about fishing in the last few days. Yeah, it's quite interesting, actually. So, sir, I do say, so there was another point as well, in terms of the nature of the crewing of French ships. They revolving crews, which means those vessels are out fishing constantly. Now, some of that time won't be in our waters, it might be in other waters, but they are still equipped to fish at any time in those waters. And that's the subtle changes in the nature of the fishing that is undertaken that we need to be wary of. And it's that uncertainty that worries me before we, and the word isn't condemn, that's the wrong word, before we allow perhaps influence on an industry that has been so paramount to Jersey's identity for so long. And so they're just words of warning that are in my mind. And I think this is the place to have those in this debate. So I'll leave you with that, sir. Thank you.
Deputy Gorst. I beg your pardon? Deputy Cathcart, did you have a question?
So could I ask a question of the Solicitor General?
You can, if it's yes, of course. What question do you have?
Okay. I understand, of course, that Jersey is bound by agreements already made. And just to help the Assembly, I wanted to ask, is it possible for Jersey to make its own, to have its jurisdiction over particular issues in the regulations, like whether to allow for larger replacement vessels? Because this is the issue that was brought up by the Jersey Fishermen's Association. In this case, nothing to do with anything else.
Forgive me, is the question, can this Assembly legislate to give the Minister power to licence larger vessels than he can at present? Yes, this Assembly is sovereign and can legislate in whatever way it chooses.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and I hesitate to rise on this subject. Perhaps I'd just caveat the Solicitor General's advice. I'm sure, as advised to the States, he would say, providing it wasn't in breach of our international obligations, and we'd have to balance those two things.
No, it's my answer's the same. This Assembly can legislate in the way proposed. If it chooses, however, to conduct itself in a way that places it arguably in breach of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, then the agreement itself provides a mechanism by which that can be addressed by other parties to the agreement. So in this instance, it would be the French. There are a number of steps the French might consider taking if they considered we were in breach. They are in Article 506 of the TCA. They include suspending in whole or in part access to its waters by our ships and preferential tariff treatment granted to fishery products under Article 21. So it would give them the option at least of starting a tariff war. And there are other sanctions that a party to the agreement could seek to pursue. It's a lengthy process. It's designed above all to culminate in a civilised settlement through mediation. But those risks are there if the Assembly legislates in a way that arguably would put it in breach of the agreement. In terms of dealing with such breaches, I understand we would be represented for such purposes by the UK pursuant to an agreement and a memorandum of understanding, which I've not seen, but which deals with how that would work in practice.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Yes, it was just fortuitous. We earlier today had some arguments about restorationism, and at least one speaker this afternoon has also made an argument about restorationism, and I just wanted to provide some background context as it were, because the Environment Minister gave, not the Environment Minister, the Economic Development Minister gave a speech with which some of us are familiar on his views about Brexit and the implications of Brexit to the United Kingdom and by extension to ourselves. And things have also been suggested about the work of the Minister for the Environment and the External Relations Minister. And I wish to distance myself from those. I think they are doing an excellent job in unravelling some of the unfinished implication difficulties of implementing the TCA in Jersey. Deputy Balash was right, although others have doubted it. One of the main benefits of the TCA to Jersey was the repatriation of the rights of Jersey to manage its own waters. That may not be accepted by some in our community, but it is there in black and white. And this Assembly and the Minister is now the licensing authority for Jersey waters. It was never going to be possible, of course, for any Jersey minister to do anything other than reach agreement around licensing French vessels. It was suggested to me at the time of Brexit that why on earth would we ever want to? French vessels and Jersey vessels have been fishing in the Bay of Granville for hundreds and hundreds of years, and those fishers see them as their waters undivided almost. It's a political construct, and it's a construct of sovereignty that says there is this dividing line. These are Jersey waters, these are French waters, these are Guernsey waters, these are UK waters. Therefore, it was always going to be necessary for Jersey to issue licenses to those vessels who could, in this instance, show a historic track record in our waters. Now, they've provided evidence to show that historic track record, and all of that data the Environment Minister now uses to issue licenses, but also importantly uses to, as he described, deal with what's technically known as extent and nature, but to you and I and the layman could be the overall amount of fish that can be caught in our waters. So this idea, the Environment Minister used the word cap, and that's a good way of thinking about it. So in some respects, you could have 20 boats that can fish the same cap of fish. Of course, it doesn't work quite like that because each boat has its own extent and nature. Or you could have 150 boats with the same cap. You've got the same amount of fish coming out of the water, but how they do it is determined by that historic data. So the context of Brexit is, we remind ourselves, before Brexit, the Jersey Fishing Association were determined to rip up the Bay of Granville. The number of previous environment ministers to whom they had said they wanted to stop the Bay of Granville agreement because it was not working in Jersey's interest goes back beyond this environment minister and probably the last two, if not three or four before that. And they had themselves withdrawn from the bodies which the Bay of Granville Agreement set up to support joint management of waters, and they made the very strongest of representations to say that that agreement was no longer, in their view, working in Jersey's interest, and that it should be ripped up, and that French boats, there should be a new relationship between Jersey and French boats. What was Brexit in regard to fishing was all about the two competing aims. One was the control of water, and the other was access to markets. And the Jersey fishing fleet started, of course, to suffer during COVID, and then COVID aligned with Brexit meant that they ran into difficulties. But those difficulties are not delivered by the number of licenses vessels licensed, if they can show that historic work. They are delivered by the friction on the ports in Normandy and in Brittany. And it is that work that the External Relations Minister is trying ever so carefully and ever so diplomatically to say, okay, we, or the Environment Minister, is going to sort out the replacement vessels, which has been an issue from day one. And when I was Minister and there was a former Environment Minister, we said, no, we're not going to sort that out until we've gone through this process and sorted these other issues out. There was a day, sir, when...
Excuse me, did you wish to make an intervention of some sort?
Please, sir, just a point of clarification, because...
Do you give way for a point of clarification?
It's exactly what we're debating, because the scrutiny panel, the environmental scrutiny panel, has called these regulations in. Are we debating whether they have the right to do that, or are we still debating...
It's not a point of clarification from
right.
the Speaker. I think, if anything, that's a point of clarification.
Sorry,
point of
then
order
it's a
from
question
myself.
of order. Oh,
the position is we are debating the principles.
Still.
The
right.
scrutiny panel is absolutely entitled to call the matter in, but only once the Assembly has approved the principles. If the Assembly does not approve the principles, the entire matter falls away. If the Assembly does approve the principles, then the scrutiny panel is entitled to call it in. That's
Thank
the
you, sir.
situation at the moment. I beg your pardon for the...
Please, I'm sorry to interrupt, Senator.
Sorry, it's no problem. So I hadn't seen the Deputy wishing to intervene, so I apologise to her as well. And so the problems arose because even though the TECA gave access to markets, or tariff-free access to markets, there was a need for new facilities at various ports. Those facilities got bogged down in red tape, be that in Normandy or Paris or Brussels, throughout the system, we could say. And what the incoming ministers have sought to do is to unravel and cut through some of that red tape, start to build positive relationships and work together with their counterparts in Normandy and Brittany and in Paris and in Brussels, so that that friction at the border is eliminated to the largest extent possible. Port opening times are extended, and we hope that ultimately we'll have this new facility at Granville as well, which will allow a reversion to the sort of market access that was prior to Brexit, where catches can be appropriately checked and administered. And it's building that goodwill, that work of diplomacy that I think they're doing an excellent job on, that is very much connected with the commitment of dealing with replacement vessels, and that's what the Minister is doing, and that's why he's taken longer than he would have liked to bring this before the Assembly. And it is extremely important that this Assembly shows that it can be a trusted partner with its international colleagues. And I don't think that this is a pantomime, as others have suggested. I actually think the ministers are doing a very good job under the most trying of circumstances, because the Christmas and New Year that Deputy Morell refers to, this Assembly could have made the decision not to be party to the TECA, despite Guernsey and the Isle of Man being party to it. That would have left us with a Bay of Granville agreement with a member state. We remind ourselves of what would have been. We would have been outside of the TECA. We'd have had no tariff-free access to markets. We'd have had all of the same sanitary issues of landing fish into the European market, and we would have been completely on the back foot for negotiating another agreement that was bespoke. And the reason I say that is, sir, all these years down the line, Gibraltar were not allowed in the TECA because of the position taken by European Union member states. And as we stand here today, they still have no agreement with the European Union. And that would not have served the interests of Jersey, its supply line, all the work that the Economic Development Ministry is seeking to do in extending supply lines to the south, and it certainly would have not been in the best interests of Jersey fishers. It really would have been the end of them. So there will be this continuing light at the end of the tunnel, sir. My colleague ministers, I have every confidence in them. They are making progress. And if I understand rightly the chair of the scrutiny panel, they are really, as much as anything, rather than seeking to scrutinise the legislation, which I understand they're supporting in first reading, they want to scrutinise the underlying policy. And I think that's quite important, and it's an important message that ministers, my colleague ministers, will be able to relay to their European and their French counterparts. I'm not sure, as I stand here, how the Minister for the Environment is going to deal with that interregnum of a week around issuing licences when one bit of legislation stops and they won't have any certainty until this Assembly, if it does, passes the regulations a week later. That will be for him and the External Relations Minister to deal with. So I'm grateful for that confirmation. I think that's a correct understanding of it, but it does still leave ministers with managing that relationship through that week's difficulty, but I imagine they will find a way around that, sir. So I'm going to sit down and be quiet now, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does any other member wish to speak on the principles? If no other member wishes to speak on the principles, I close the debate and call upon the Minister to respond.
Thank you, sir. That was actually very useful in some respects, and in one particular important respect, which was that it was perhaps remiss of me not to speak more in my opening speech about the Jersey fishing fleet, because that is an issue that is always on my mind. I've had several long discussions with the chair of the JFA. I regret that I've not been able to persuade him to withdraw his opposition to this. I'll deal with a couple of his points in a moment, but I do want to say that I am absolutely committed to the Jersey fishing fleet, to ensuring that we have a sustainable fishery and a fishery that works for both fleets. So I'll deal with a few more points of detail in a moment. The first thing to say is I think this question about what happens at the end of this month, what happens on January the 31st and then on February the 1st. The two things that we're talking about here are separate. The replacement vessel policy is something that we would like to pass in order to fulfill, if you like, our side of the bargain in terms of extent and nature. What will actually happen on February the 1st is that Jersey at this point becomes Jersey is the licensing authority for all French vessels in our waters. We extended the licenses until January the 31st to coincide with the deadline for the end of the extent and nature discussions. We will issue new licenses on February the 1st for all the qualifying French vessels with permits. And this will be the first time that they will have permits. Those permits will be the permits that have been agreed as a result of the extent and nature discussions. That is the point at which the French say, through the EU, say quite legitimately, okay, you now have your limits. You know what these permits are covering. So why can't we have a replacement vessel policy that is a little more flexible? So that is the situation in terms of what happens then. So there were a few points that are worth picking up in terms of what the reform deputies have been, points they've been making. It's true the JFA do not agree that we should modify the replacement vessel policy. And I think that does illustrate one of the problems I have here, because There is a simple fact here that if people are finding very, very difficult to accept, even when I say it over and over again, even when officers say it over and over again, and that is that there are caps here. There is a cap on the total size of the French fleet. And there is a cap through the extent and nature and through the permits that result from the extent and nature discussions, there is a cap on the total catch. And both of those are fixed on the previous reference period. They are caps. You can have a bigger boat. You can have a more powerful boat if these regulations are amended. Only slightly, remember, 10% more power. It does not matter that you can fish in rougher waters. It does not matter that you can get to your fishing place quicker. You can still only catch the same amount of fish. I have made this point over and over again, so have officers. I think the problem is that, for reasons I don't quite understand, it isn't fully accepted. It is the case. Questions are raised around compliance as the kind of final issue that sort of questions, that people raise questions about this. Well, yes, there's a cap, but the French will not follow it. I have to say that we have now an experience of a year of the license situation. French vessels have been licensed for a year, and the condition of the license is they have to have satellite tracking equipment on them, one of the many conditions, actually. We have, therefore, been able to monitor the position and movements of the French fleet throughout the last year. That is an important, a vital part of the compliance process. It means we can see what the fleet is up to. It means we can perform intelligence-led investigations of particular boats. It means getting into some of the technicalities, but if you're doing a scallop fishing run, you are traveling at a certain speed in the same direction for a certain amount of time before the bags fill up. That is all pretty well known. That doesn't change. So sitting in officers at Howard Davis Farm, our officers can see which boats are scallop dredging at any one time. They know the bag limits. They know it's 1.3 tons a day. They can measure the amount of fishing effort, and if it looks like a boat is going over it, they can immediately go out. So our investigations, which in the past were on the basis, because we weren't tracking the fleet, was on the basis of we'll just go and take a look today and see what's happening out there. Today, our system is much more effective. We can say, that looks a bit dodgy. What's going on there? And the boat can go out immediately. I have to say, speaking to officers, that there is very little evidence that the French fleet is cheating the system. I can only report what I'm told. So I do want to really get people to focus on these realities. It's very easy to throw sand in people's eyes and say, well, yes, but faster boats, surely that's more effective, more efficient, and so on. It will be more efficient. But the reason you might think, well, why do the French want all of these bigger boats then? They're not just fishing in our waters. They fish in English waters, in other French waters. So for them, it makes sense to have a boat that is a bit bigger to fish in our waters, which they can also use to fish more effectively in other areas where they're allowed to fish. It's not some nefarious plot to get past the slightly dim Jersey folk who won't realise what they're up to. So I think, again, I want really to focus on the realities of this situation rather than the sort of fears. But I do understand that there have been fears. We will hopefully, with this extra time that we will have a chance to allay those fears. I'm just looking through my notes to make sure I address the points. Deputy Balash raised a point about the wording of the agreement. It's a valid point, actually. We should look at that. The reason why it was written like that was it was also implied that officers might make decisions. So it didn't directly relate to the minister. It didn't only relate to the minister, because the sub-clauses relate to several different matters, some of which it was envisaged might be designed by officers. But I think we could look at that to be more specific. There was also questions about what exactly it is, where exactly the discretion exists. And so it's worth just highlighting the very key part of the amendment, the amended regulations, that creates the power for discretion. The amended regulations keep with all the existing ways in which I could authorise a replacement French vessel, but it creates one extra category, Category B, which allows the minister, where the minister decides to accept as a substitute vessel, having regard to the policy published by the minister from time to time. That's the discretion, having regard to the policy published by the minister from time to time. That is why I published the policy. It was not some pantomime to produce it at this point. The use of the word choreography, I think the entire assembly, with the exception of perhaps one member, understood that I was trying to find phrases that captured the diplomatic subtleties of what's going on. I published that policy in the hope that people would gain some comfort that that very vague and general clause, B, with regard to having regard to the policy published by the minister from time to time, was not just me sitting in the office one day saying, this week we'll do this. It's a thought-through policy. It creates different categories. It's very clear what it's trying to do. So Deputy Ward calls it a coincidence, a suspicious coincidence that the support package for Jersey fishermen was announced on Monday. It's actually part of the marine economy framework, I think I may have said that correctly, that the Minister for Economic Development has been working on for many, many months and has been the result of considerable discussion. I think you could look at it a different way and say our Jersey fishing fleet has the advantage of 3 different ministers who work exceptionally hard. I would say the whole Council of Ministers, but 3 ministers who have in their specific remits the brief to examine and to consider issues that relate to our fleet. We have the Economic Development Minister who, as you can see, has done a major piece of work and that has borne fruit. The External Relations Minister who has been working tirelessly, not just on this, but on things like the access to port, the closure of the French ports, the restrictions on opening times, and achieved a very good result for our fishing fleet. And my officers working to try and sort out extent and nature in line with the TCA. So what I would urge is, we're in this position where scrutiny have said they will call it in. I can't pretend that I would have preferred it not to. It's not ideal, but we are a democracy. It is entirely the right of scrutiny to call it in. And I'm going to look on the bright side. I hope we can achieve an even greater level of agreement and consensus around this as a result of that extra time. I hope that we can allay whatever remaining fears there may be, any reservations that may exist, and clarify any points that members may still have doubts over. I know it will make things harder for the Minister for External Relations and his team. We are going to have to hope that our negotiating counterparts understand the situation in which we find ourselves. But I would urge every member, please, to vote for this proposition at the principles stage. It is a really important message to send to our negotiating partners that we understand the significance of what we're doing. The safeguard you have in place is that scrutiny is going to call it in and examine the details. But I urge all members, please, to vote to support this proposition. Thank you very much. I call for the appeal.
Sir, can I ask for the Minister to make a clarification of his speech? Yeah, can I just ask the Minister, as he... The Minister needs to sit down. Thank you. I'm grateful for the Minister's observations. Can I just ask him to send out, to be clear, about the extent to which the possibility of changing the regulations which we would not be dealing with versus the policy. Could you just please give a clarification about the ability to change the regulations which are not, we can't discuss because if we get past the principles versus the policy?
So, point of order, there seems to be a fine line between asking for a point of clarification and making a suggestion about how one might extend one's speech to incorporate something that Senator Joseph, Deputy Joseph, didn't say in his speech as Minister.
I'm not sure that it is a point of clarification, as I was hearing you say it, Deputy Joseph. It seems to me that you're not asking the Minister to clarify, you're asking him to provide further information. If you wish to express it as would he please clarify a particular position, then you're able to do that.
Can he clarify what the regulations are versus the policy?
Yes, sir, I can. The regulations are the sections written down in the order paper. The key one I've identified is section B. I think that's the one that probably is the one that's caused all the issues. The policy is the document I sent around separately, which indicates the policy framework in which I would exercise the discretion given to me by the changing regulations.
Very well. The appel is called for. I invite members to return to their seats. The vote is on the principles. I ask the greffier to open the voting and members to cast their votes in the normal way. If members have had the opportunity of casting their votes, then I ask the greffier to close the voting. The principles have been adopted. 37 votes pour, no votes contre, and abstentions.
May we have the abstentions, please, sir?
Those abstaining, Deputy Tadier, Rob Ward, Alves, Mezek, Coles, Catherine Curtis, Feltham and Kovac.
Very well. You wish to call this matter in, as you've indicated?
I do, sir, thank you.
And when would you propose to have it relisted for discussion in the Assembly?
So my panel realises the importance of this. We're already committed to come back to the next Assembly, which I believe is the 7th of February, 1 week after the 1st of February.
The draft regulations are called into scrutiny to be relisted for the 7th of February, which is the earliest opportunity on which they can be relisted for further debate. That concludes public business, and I call upon the Chair of PPC to propose the arrangement for future business.
Thank you, sir. One additional proposition has been lodged since the publication of the Consolidated Laws paper. The Draft Banking Business Amendment 7 Commencement Act has been listed for the 28th of February 2023. There are only a few propositions listed for next time, and as just been stated, the draft fishing regulations, which was due to be debated this afternoon, has been called in by scrutiny, and the date for the resumption of the debate will be on the 7th of February. As there are so few propositions listed for next time, I believe that we may be able to finish business within 2 days at the next sitting, but members should always bear in mind the continuation days that have been set aside, just in case we don't finish within 2 days. Thank you.
Do members agree the arrangement of business is proposed by the Chair of PPC? Very well. That concludes the business of the Assembly, and we stand adjourned until the 7th of February.